This is a question on which I have deliberately been silent for decades, and I'm not going to go into a torrent of denunciation here, but say something briefly. Alan Greenspan testified before Congress about the recent economic troubles and now blames this mess on the free market, evading the fact that we have never had such a thing. How in the world can a person go from writing gold and economic freedom to being such a corrupt and intellectually dishonest statist? A good question. All I can do is give you some observed facts through the years. In the 1950s, which is when I knew Alan, he was a totally different person from what he obviously is today. He's just not the same person now. I'll give you, I guess, a personal biographical touch that would be relevant here. In the early days, when both Alan and I were getting to know Ayn Rand, she observed that there was a difference between us, that we both committed a certain error in opposite directions. I gave too much emphasis to the moral and not enough to the practical, and Alan too much emphasis to the practical and not enough to the moral. And she told us we each had to work to correct this error, not separate mind and body. And I did work, if I say so myself, and ultimately did integrate the two. But Alan never did. He favored that axis and minimized morality, an attitude which became much worse when he went to Washington and was confronted by compromisers and justified giving in on the grounds of, well, it's better to get something done than nothing, which in some cases was better. And increasingly, the longer he was in Washington, the more he wanted, had a desire to rise and be accepted and be one of them. And the less, therefore, ideas abstractly mattered. He still proclaimed his overall philosophy. I mean, he told people he was a follower of Ayn Rand, but ideas stopped meaning to him in the face of approval and concrete-bound deals. And I think ideas actually atrophied in his mind and became insignificant, a liturgy that didn't really tie to reality. Then the major crisis came. He no longer had any ideas to explain it. And this once brilliant, and believe me, he was once tremendously brilliant. You would have been stunned by his intelligence. This one-time pro-capitalist has turned himself into an unintelligent, anti-intellectual evader, and is now doing so in the guise of being honest and admitting his ideas are wrong, and he fesses up to it. I think there's another motive here, too, that if he were to face what the actual cause was, he would discover that a very big part of it is the behavior of the Federal Reserve under his jurisdiction in the final years. And it's perhaps easier for him, if ideas aren't that important, to blame the philosophy rather than to say, I'm the cause of the disaster, or at least part of the cause. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Alan Greenspan. I refrained from any comment for many, many, many years, but this one is just too much to refrain from. What is your opinion on asexuality? Well, I take that to mean asceticism, abstinence, rejection of sex as an activity. Now, if it's as a result of a physical cause, then it's not a moral issue. If you can't, you can't. But if it's voluntary, then I think it's completely horrible. it is a rejection of life as such, because that is the most intense pleasure of life, more intense than creativity. Creativity is a different kind, but it does not reach ever the violence that is routine in sex. So a person who says, I am abstaining from that, is rejecting the highest pleasure of life, and that means value of life, and that is inherently corrupt. I do not believe that that can be honest. I believe that belief in God can be honest, but not the rejection of sex. I think that has to be motivated by rebellion against the body, against the reality of this world, against the genitals, just the refusal to accept what you are and where you are. If you know the objectivist view of sex, you know that we do not regard it as purely physical, but as expressive of fundamental premises and fundamental values. So to cut it off is to say I'm giving my mind and values no major expression in my life, or I'm cutting off a major expression. And it's not an accident, therefore, that the priests were sworn from the beginning, way back in the early ancient world, to give up sex, and because at the same time they had to follow absolute obedience, be ascetic in regard to food, and not talk. Priests had to be silent because they had to give up concepts too. That was the whole idea of a true Christian, someone who gave up everything. And this is one manifestation of it, that I don't believe any Greek, however vicious, would have, well, maybe one Stoic, but mostly they would never have thought of such a thing. And of course, you see what happens when obedience and chastity and asexuality becomes the rule of an institution. You just read the newspapers and see what's happening with the Catholic Church, and then ask whether you think it all started 30 years ago, but that before that there was 1900 years of, friendly. That's all I have to say on that. Is it a contradiction for atheists to reject mysticism but endorse altruism? Yes, assuming you mean by atheism naturalism. In other words, the rejection of all forms of supernaturalism, which is wider than merely God. The reason I say that is because supernaturalism is the base for altruism. Altruism is, in essence, what life requires versus sacrifice. And there's no basis whatever in a world of living entities to tell them to do an action which destroys themselves. If you get that, it must be something mystical demands it. And that is always God, or God in a pretend secular form. And I mean by that the communist God, for example. They are atheists, but they believe in the dialectic process and the rest of their ideology as a supernatural phenomenon which demands sacrifice. On that, I urge you to read Dim, because I have a chapter showing why communism is religion. Not because of the intensity of its faith, which is a stupid reason, but because it actually believes in a supernatural realm. I'm male, 32 years old, and feel obligated to myself, my family, and society in general to have children. Isn't it man's purpose on earth to participate in continuing the human race? Certainly not. Why would that be his purpose? If you subscribe to an egoist philosophy, your purpose has to be the pursuit and achievement of your life, your welfare, your happiness, not your dedication to the human race as such. Each of them is obligated to pursue their own welfare or happiness. If you followed your policy, you would be, in essence, an unselfish parent. You'd be having a child not because of the pleasure and joy you would get in bringing him up and educating him and seeing him develop and so on, but simply because you want to throw his body in the genetic pool so he'll keep it going. Now, I'd like you to concretize that by imagining that you tell the truth to your child if you have him for that reason. Sit him down one day and say, you know, I have no selfish feeling for you, no desire. I just wanted you to throw you on so people would keep on going. Your kid would rebel and reject you. He wouldn't want you to have continuing the human race through him. It would be monstrous. You're making him as his goal just to link to somebody else's kid, etc., with no consumer. The idea of having a child for the greater glory of the collective, I can only think of two examples. The Nazis, who had homes for women to give birth so there would be more Nazis, and the Catholics, who forbid birth control in the effort to build up their population. It is not your obligation, or it's not even proper for you to be motivated by the effects of your actions on mankind. Either most people, as now, do want to have children, and so you don't have a problem. They don't need you. Or they don't want to have children, and if so, your single procreation is irrelevant. What will happen to the human race? It'll either die out if nobody wants it to continue, or there will be a future evolution. It'll start over again, either here or in some other place in the universe, and hopefully it'll start off with a better philosophy the next time, if it happens. I was bullied very severely in middle and high school many years ago, but I'm still deeply disturbed and depressed. I can't force the memories to go away. Is it the bully's fault for traumatizing me for this long, or is it my fault for holding on to such irrational premises as to still be bothered by events that happened so many years ago and that I know will never happen again? Of course, I would say it is 100% the bully's fault. They unleashed attacks, probably physical and linguistic, that cut you down at a time when you were helpless and relatively ignorant. The fact that it was long ago is, bullies, I may say, are really wicked people. 99 times out of 100. The 100th is the guy who's a bully just because he wants to be liked by the other bullies. The fact that this is a long time ago, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, is completely irrelevant. You must have had some profound philosophic conclusion implicitly from this experience. They all hate me, I'm helpless, I'm no good, I can't do anything about it, I'm the butt of the world, I'm an outcast, how can I ever get along in the world? What kind of future can I expect? In other words, a real assault on your self-esteem and your view of a benevolent, hopeful life and universe. That does not go away, even if there's only some incidents 20, 40 years ago that provoked it. It cannot go away unless you do something on that level, because it becomes your metaphysics. It becomes your way of looking at the world and functioning, and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you feel unconfident, you don't undertake tasks which require confidence, so you continue to reiterate to yourself how lacking you are. And the same if you think the world is hostile, you don't venture into the world nearly as much, and so you more and more get the idea you can't get anywhere in this world. You have to get rid of these premises, get rid of these problems, but the only way you can do it is by therapy. It would be almost impossible to uproot and reintegrate in a more rational way. A therapist would have to take you back over the concretes, make you, as far as I understand, I'm not a therapist, make you really remember in detail these episodes, and the conclusions you came to, and then take you through the high points of your life, showing how they were influenced and put you on the wrong track all the way, and meanwhile providing for you an idea of a baby step and then a bigger step and then a bigger toward a better viewpoint. It's a long, difficult thing. I 100% sympathize with you. It is not your fault. You know, there's a documentary out now called Bully, which I mean to see. But I do think bullies are a bad, bad problem in the schools, and that it's a disgrace, among other things, that they are allowed to flourish as they do. After a history of bullying in school, which did nothing about it, I moved to a new school where I was targeted by another individual. This time, I decided to respond by punching him in the face, and the bully stopped. He left me alone. Was my use of force justified in this case? In the context you present, definitely yes, it's self-defense. Even if he wasn't doing anything explicitly, his language and proximity to you, etc., would justify you in taking it as an implicit threat, and you went to the authorities and they wouldn't do anything about it. I would think it would have been a good idea to warn him once that you have the ability to do that and you intend to do that. I probably wouldn't have stopped him, but 1 in 1,000 maybe it would. As long as you take bullying to mean the implicit or explicit use of force against you, which could be getting a gang of people following you closely, screaming at you, etc. That's plenty for you, or even one person doing it, for you to take this as you require self-defense, if the authorities won't help. But you can't take bullying as this guy and his friends across the field are sneering at me and spitting at the ground at me in effigy and so on. However blatantly they express their dislike, it has to cross over to at least the implicitly physical before you're justified in punching him in the nose. Hi, this is Leonard Peikoff answering questions emailed to me about Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. I deal with questions of general interest as against technicalities for PhDs on the one hand, or practical, narrowly practical questions such as who to vote for in politics on the other hand. I do this every 2 weeks, and the podcast appears every other Monday on my website, which is Peikoff, P as in Peter, E-I-K-O-F-F, Peikoff.com. And if you want to ask me a philosophical question, feel free. Just send it to leonard@peikoff.com. We'll start today with a question about career choice. And the question says, I'm experiencing a very difficult conflict between what I want and what is practical. I want to write nonfiction. Additionally, I want to enjoy my life. I want to be able to not worry about where I will get my next meal, to buy new shoes, take a woman out on a date, etc. It seems like either way, I am sacrificing. He says he hasn't got enough money to support himself without taking the kind of job that would wipe out all these things. And the first thing I would say is that choice is not sacrifice. Anytime you act, you are selecting one course over another. That doesn't mean you're sacrificing the first for the second. Sacrifice is defined by your hierarchy of values. If you choose the higher value and give up the lesser, that is not a sacrifice. That's your choice. If you choose the lesser and give up the higher, that is a sacrifice. And you have to decide in an issue like this, which is the higher value to you. Now, you know yourself best, speaking to the questioner, so you know your own hierarchy. But if I just took the question straight as a stranger asking it, I would advise you to go with the practical career, not with writing. Because writing at least to the best of my knowledge, is a tremendous struggle. It has the potential to make you miserable from the demands of creativity. And I would only advise a person to take that kind of career if they have a passion for writing, such that all these other things, shoes and restaurants and nightclubs and so on, are irrelevant. If they don't, if these other things are important to you, that's perfectly okay. It's perfectly moral. There is no obligation, to go into a profession like that. There's no obligation to go at all, easy or hard, if you prefer a different kind of life and you still have using your mind productively. But if you do choose non-writing for that kind of valid reason, then I would say do it guiltlessly. Don't feel, I'm just doing the practical and abandoning the moral. In your context, if you are weighing values appropriately, you should be guiltless and enjoy your new shoes. Unless it kills you not to write, in which case then you don't care that much about the shoes.
Play writer's advocate. I mean, if a person is young, he can lack knowledge, A, about what he really does value in the career realm, and B, what are the real prospects as a writer. I mean, he could very well be wrong about them. I mean, some of us at ARI do okay. So don't you think it's relevant to bring up to such a person that, maybe you should just try it and see if this is really something that you can be passionate about?
You can always say, if you're not sure, then try it and see. But also trying it and see, the shorter your time interval of trying, the less you're going to find out, the less you're going to see. So does he want to take off a year? Does he want to take off 2 years and write a whole book? Does he have an interest in writing a short op-ed type column? That's all things he'd have to decide. I'm simply saying creative writing as a lifetime, which is what he wants to know. Should he choose that, or should he choose the practical? Okay, now I've got a series of questions here on different aspects of the Fountainhead, a whole bunch of them. Do you think Howard Rourke would look back on his decision to build the Cortlandt homes and say to himself, I made an error of judgment? I think this question says, Rourke's motivation in doing this project was selfish in solving a difficult architectural problem, and he wouldn't second-guess his reasons for taking the assignment, but would he likely have been turned off working on any such assignment for the rest of his career, i.e. any project where he would become involved with government bureaucracy? I agree, with this question totally. That's a difference, one of the differences between Rourke and Galt. Rourke is learning. He does not know about people. He's not fully clear on a lot of the things that Galt knows. Of course, Galt learned them from the fact that Rourke existed, and Ayn Rand was able to give that knowledge to Galt, but Rourke did definitely make an error, which he said in the book. That does not mean that Rourke is imperfect, as against Galt being perfect, but it does mean that he was younger and less knowledgeable about people than Galt. Another one, Fountainhead. At the end, Gale says that he is building the last skyscraper to ever be built. He was a smart man. How did he not realize that the world still had hope when Rourke won the case? Well, I think the answer is very straightforward. By the end of the book, Gale had learned that his method of achieving values, the principles on which he had lived his entire life, would necessarily lead to failure. He's older now. He was thinking at one point how much longer he has to live. And looking back at the total of his life, he had to feel it's a malevolent universe. He can't achieve his values, whatever Rourke can, because he's subverted his capacity throughout his life. And now, where is he going to go, and with what motivation? He can't, at this point, as presented in the novel, it's over for him. He even says that dead things like the banner are the fertilizer that enable. So he implies that there's going to be something better, but not for him and not in his world. Another one from the Fountainhead. These people all want to redeem the villains. Not that wine is a villain. In the Fountainhead, there is a scene where Peter Keating shows Howard Rourke a collection of personal paintings. After examining them, Rourke informs Keating that it is too late, and Keating assents. To my mind, Keating's paintings are a result of the same kind of inner drive and personal ambition that Rourke manifests. They're the embryonic stirrings of a personal purpose. So why does Rourke say it's too late? Again, you have to look at this question from the point of view of the character as he has been developed, as his fundamental motivation has been presented, as he has lived. This man has automatized dependence. Throughout his life, he has not subconsciously stored any value judgments of his own. Or if he has made them so buried, so repressed, so unreachable that they don't do him any good. And the essential thing an artist needs is independent value judgments to enable him to present his view of what's important in reality. He's burned out or emptied out or never filled the motor. Plus, his life has been a failure of catastrophic proportions, even in his own terms. His self-esteem has collapsed. You can't say about someone at that stage in his life who it's like the flickering of a few ashes where he's trying to recreate something that he has destroyed. Well, he also has a selfish interest and so on. It's just a matter of strengthening his ambition. You're ignoring the character. Now, the questioner goes on to say that I said in some lecture that even if you're 80 or 90, you have the chance to rethink your errors and start again. Well, I wouldn't put it quite so strongly at this stage in my life. I would say you have the capacity, but only if you have the time and the motive and the energy and the knowledge to correct automatized mistakes. That's a lot of ifs. So it can be done, but it would have to be a rare person, and certainly not Peter Keating. Now here's another. In Ayn Rand's notes, she says, with regard to communism, that it, quote, places among single individuals Toohey at the top of the human pyramid, unquote. And yet in the novel, Gus Webb tells Toohey that he's an incurable specimen of the intelligentsia, that's all he is, that he's not the man of the future, and Toohey sighs and says, you're right. So was there a change in Ayn Rand's thinking here? Definitely not. The first quote pertains to the way communists regard Toohey. They put him at the top in terms of power and value. They are the egalitarian humanist types. When Ayn Rand is presenting Toohey as at the bottom and as powerless, that is her estimate, given her philosophy. And in her philosophy, he simply opens the door to the brute, who will then push him away. So it's the final consistent end of communist ideals. So it's the exact opposite of changing her mind. Okay, I have one here. Believe it or not, I don't know if the questioner expects this. It's taken straight out of the Confessions of St. Augustine. Is there no present tense? If an instant has no duration, how can time be made of infinity of them? Is time an infinite flow of infinitesimals and instants? Well, you know, St. Augustine took that in this form. The past doesn't exist anymore. The future doesn't exist yet, so all that exists is the present. But how long is the present? If you say 1 second, well, the first half doesn't exist yet, and the next half, etc. And consequently, that's infinitely small, so there's no present, there's no past, and there's no future. Therefore, there's only eternity where God is, and this world is a delusion. So the answer to this was given before Augustine by Aristotle, when he said infinity is only a potentiality of mentally organizing something. It is not, never an actuality. You can always take a second or a stretch of time or a space and think of half of it, and half of that, and half of that. But wherever you stop, you have a finite amount. You can never keep going to reach an infinite amount by definition, because that would have no identity. And therefore, it's only amounts to saying you can keep subdividing, but so what? It's like you can keep adding numbers, but you never say 2,000,009,000,000 infinity. There's always 2,000,000,010, so it's just a potentiality. So I wouldn't worry about that. What do you think of debates where students are pre-assigned to argue for or against an issue regardless of its merits and their beliefs? Is there any possible benefit to being asked to persuade individuals of a wrong idea? Absolutely not. It's extremely harmful to teach students to evade facts and twist data in order to convince the audience of what they believe is wrong. That is a deliberate separation of thought from fact, of reasoning from reality. And that is as corrupt as anything can be. It elevates the skill of bamboozling people with language over concern for reality. I don't like debates as such, even if you're debating the truth. Now, your own does excellently at it, but I hate them and won't take part in them because it's tremendously one-sided today. The other side has the whole context taken for granted of altruism, collectivism, etc. And objectivist answers to a particular question depend on trying to cover and carry in a vast context that nobody knows or believes. And therefore, it's so one-sided, so impossible to get a fair hearing in that format. I don't do it. Now, somehow, your own does it, and I've watched him do it, and he's very good at it, but it's beyond me and always was. That's it for today. If you want to know more about Ayn Rand's philosophy, I invite you to ask me a question. I can't answer all of them because there's too many, but we do read all of them. Just write to leonard@peikoff.com. Or if you haven't already done so, start by reading Ayn Rand's two most famous novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Thanks for listening. Would an objectivist child be taught to share the last piece of cake with his brother? No. I mean, assuming it's not his brother's piece. If he chooses to do it, that's okay. That's if it's his piece. But not if he chooses under pressure from his parents. Not if he does it out of duty. Because the implication otherwise is that sharing is a value, a virtue, a proper way of behavior, and that is wrong. Sharing as such is not a correct or a value. Sharing amounts to, in this case, giving some cake to someone who doesn't have it because he doesn't have it. And that is a complete injustice. It's an assault on idea of private property. It's telling this kid, you never really own anything because there's other people in the world who, without doing anything to earn it, have a claim on you, and you're wrong if you don't split it up and give it to them. So sharing toys, sharing food, if it's something other than, casual friendship unprompted by parents is okay. That is wrong. You've said that foreigners have no civil rights in another country. What are civil rights, and what rights do you think foreigners do have? Well, foreigners have human rights. In other words, they have the right to life, liberty, property. And these they have by the fact that they are human, whether they're in this country or their own. But I say they do not have civil rights. Civil rights are the rights of the citizens of a particular country. And they define everything that pertains to how the government should protect human rights. And there's all kinds of this search and seizure, trial by jury, right to vote. There's many different rules governing the government. Now, the government is paid for by the citizens. Foreigners have no claim, no rights to the methods that are being used, no say in it, and they get no protection beyond being human. We cannot kill them, except according to our standards of due process. We can't take their property, etc. But it's up to us, for instance, to decide, are they going to get a trial by jury or not? As against the view today that any criminal should get a show trial in New York City. Are they going to have a right to vote on border questions? When is search and seizure appropriate in their case, if they come in trucks across the border, etc.? In all such issues, anything controversial about civil rights, they have no vote. They have no say. They have no claim. If they don't like what we do, then they can go home or stay away. So fundamental rights they always have. But the means of protecting these rights are important, the civil rights. So if you observe in another country serious breaches of what you consider rational legal and justice procedures, don't go. Because once you're there, you have subjected yourself. You still have your human rights, but that cannot matter very much if the way they're being protected is bad. I'm self-absorbed. Is that bad? Self-absorbed is not the same thing as egoism. Self-absorbed means essentially that you are uninterested in, indifferent to other people, including your friends, what's going on in the world. You're interested only in what you see within yourself, not in what is outside yourself as you see it. So you want to talk with others only about your own problems, only about your own issues. You may be indifferent even to the feelings of your sex partner because you're self-absorbed. Are you getting a certain feeling out of it? Now, this attitude is not good, and it is not egoistic because it is cut off from human values in reality. It amounts to the statement, I don't care to discover or respond to or act to promote values in other human beings, even though and when it is to my own selfish interest. And when, in fact, it's harmful to cut myself off that way from all these potential values. It's an attitude that comes essentially, I believe, from non-self-confidence. Whatever the problem is, though, it's a problem and requires therapy. You should be absorbed in reality and in all of the aspects that entails for a successful life in it, including the values in human being and the interest in those values. If you are, quote, self-absorbed, the implication is from the wording self versus everything else. At least that's how the distinction would be made. Now, there are cases in which you are acting truly egoistically, but people will call you self-absorbed. That is not self-absorption in the sense that I just meant. If it is, it's good because it's necessary. For instance, in some emergency, a good friend, his child may be in danger, may be sick, may require your assistance, but it's a situation in which it's your child versus his. And you simply say to yourself, I'm concerned with my child above everything else, even a close friend and his child. That is egoism, but that is commonly would be called self-absorbed. Unless you use absorbed as meaning nothing but self-interested, that is perfectly rational. It's part of holding values in reality. You should have a value focus, and you should do it in the name of your own well-being. You are the number one value, but you should recognize the number one value requires, as its full achievement and development, the recognition of an interest in values, relevant values in other people. First question. I love working with children, and I find it within my interest to educate myself into becoming a preschool or school teacher. But my friends and classmates say that this occupation would be disproportionate to my intelligence. Should I aim higher? There's no obligation at all for you to aim higher. Your friends are dead wrong. You're not digging ditches. Any profession that involves the development and use of the intellect, the discovery and application of knowledge, is equally open to thought and creativity and all the intellectual virtues. And that is certainly true of any form of education. Education is filled with crucial issues as to how to present material properly, how to develop a mind. Above all, if you're talking about preschool and early school years, the main task is how to guide the student from the perceptual level to the conceptual level properly so that he acquires concepts in a way that will help him then later use them rationally. And this is not in any sense an easy or undemanding task. You have to motivate these kids. You have to simplify by keeping essentials. You have to have the right structure. You're trying to form unformed minds. And anybody who says, I'm too intelligent to do that, that is simply fantastic. If that is what interests you, then the question here, the only thing that counts is, this is my value, my desire, my interests, and you should tell your friends simply to butt out. Just tell them this is my career and my life. I make the decisions. Does a free market require rational actors in order to function properly? No, because if they are irrational, they will lose out and ultimately be removed as a market force. For instance, if a man speculates without basis and ultimately loses his money, if he sells above the market, aiming for a higher class of people, he's undersold and loses. If he decides he's going to really undersell his competitors, go down to a real loss in order to corner the market, then if you know a history of economics, every such attempt has lost, and the guy goes broke. What happens to all these irrational schemes within economics is that they reduce the person's wealth, reduce his clout, reduce his economic power, unless, of course, he's bailed out by some wealthier friend. But that just puts it one step further. To the extent that the friend helps, he loses to that extent and goes down. The market cuts down economic irrationality just by the nature of the mechanism. It doesn't eliminate it, but it makes it unprofitable. It makes it harder to survive because you're on your own, and if you act on your whims, they don't bring you what you need. But now, if the government steps in and says, well, we've got to have rational actors, and there are irrational people in the market, so we're going to only inject ourselves when it will reintroduce rationality. Can you just imagine? Well, like, suppose the government were to say, I know you think this is too insane to be even conceived, but suppose the government were to say, well, if we were to have a rational economy, we can't be swamped with bankruptcies. And certainly not if a company is so big that it will take down a lot of small companies in its path. And therefore, we have to say some companies are just too big to fail. But of course, they can't succeed if the workers are unhappy. So only rationality if we want to promote the productive process to give those companies to the unions. And then everybody will be happy, especially if we then compel an electric car that makes those cars useless, but that'll be ecological progress, and that will be, you could go on and on like this, but you don't need me for this. You don't need a fiction writer. Ayn Rand used to say that at a certain point in cultural development, I can't write fiction anymore because no one would believe what's going on in the world now. I can't top it. Is it irrational and immoral for me to feel envious of women who are more beautiful and more intelligent? Well, I think it's okay up to a point. I'm assuming that your envy is not nihilism, not resentment of these other women, not hatred of them because of what they have, but rather that you see what they have as a value, you admire it, and you wish you had it. Now you should also have to be sure that you cannot get it yourself. There is plastic surgery. There are ways to make yourself more beautiful. And there's a difference, between feeling envious of their beauty and of their intelligence. Intelligence doesn't mean knowledge. It means the basic capacity of their mind. And the question is, can you legitimately say somebody is more intelligent than I and I envy it? If you have the capacity to recognize, to identify that intelligence concretely, what it does, then you have that level of intelligence. If you don't, then you wouldn't envy it. Now, friends, I never would have said, I envy Ayn Rand's brain. I knew that there are things she did that I have no clue of whatever, and therefore it's not something I can envy. I would say I like the product, the novels, but I can't envy the capacity to write them because I don't know what that is. I admire, but that's not the same as envy. However, beauty, you could say, I understand what it is. Now, however, your envy is justified if it is occasional and short range. If it's a lifelong, deeply, seriously emotional issue to you, then it is not irrational. You do not judge yourself, your body, any value by comparison to others. If you've read The Fountainhead, you know that that's the message. You are a first-hander. No matter what attribute is in question, you stand by what you have. If somebody is better, you can notice it. You can have a casual, I'd like to be like that, but that is not a factor involved in your life. Such a small example as I diet and I have to work at it. And other people I know can eat whatever they want and they never gain weight. And I feel envious every once in a while, but I don't think about it. It's not a big issue. It's just if I see them gorging, while I am having a toothpick, that's an exaggeration, I think, oh, I wish I was like that. But it can't be any more than that. What is the significance of actors or even everyday people who cannot stand to watch themselves on film? I've heard Johnny Depp, for example, has not watched a single one of his movies. Is this normal or a sign of something unhealthy? Well, I hope it's normal because I'm just that way with regard to my own appearances. I can't stand to hear my voice on tape and have never listened to a lecture or course once I've given it. Partly, you hear through your own head when you're speaking differently than when you hear it outside you. So you don't recognize the voice, and it sounds awful, alien. And also, you hear all the flaws in your intonations and your pauses and your squeak high and go too low, etc. It's just a really unpleasant experience. And I would be the same in a movie. I have a lot of mannerisms which come out in videos. I used to gesticulate with my hands, and at one point they were tied down my wrists behind my back so I couldn't move them before a TV appearance. But I'm aware of those. And I was trained from very young that whenever you do something, mostly I did this in teaching, but even so, whenever you do something, you look at it and you see the flaws. You try to find what you did wrong and improve it. So you don't really see what's good. You only see what's bad, and that is depressing. Now, I'm sure there are cases of unhealthy people but who have this same attitude. And maybe it's unhealthy on my part, but I sympathize with Johnny Depp on that point. This is a funnier one. Is it actually true that Ayn Rand detested facial hair on men? If so, did this include hair that was well-groomed? Yes and yes. She regarded a face, certainly as portrayed in fiction or the movie, like a painting, every aspect of which integrated, conveyed the man's, if not his essence, his soul or his way of facing life. So if you put something like a beard or a mustache, to her that was like putting a blotch on a painting. It was hiding the most evocative, expressive essence. It was disfiguring it. Now, of course, if there are physical reasons why you may want these. If you have a bad jawline, you can look better if it's filled out by a beard. My father looked so young for many years that he had to wear a big mustache to convince patients that he was old enough to treat them. But we're talking here about what you would put in a novel and what you would show on the screen. The funny story in this regard is that at one point when Ayn Rand was still involved in making the Atlas Shrugged movie, there was a large conference with all the principals sitting around the table. The producers and her agent and each side's lawyers and I think the representative of the director, etc. It was, 8 or 10 men, and her. She was the only woman. And they were going over the wording of each clause. And they were helping her try to get a wording that would precisely, legally, prohibit facial hair without getting into the problem of sideburns and how much hair on the top and all the rest of it. So they were trying to word it. And she told me this, so she looked around the room in the middle of working on this clause, and every single one had a beard or a mustache. So, but they were nevertheless, helping her and trying to figure out a way of wording it. So she obviously dealt with those people. She just didn't want them cast in her movie. And, well, I was going to say, if you saw them, you'd know why, but I can't say that, because I think some are still alive. Does it ever get any easier to see everyone working towards the destruction of this beautiful world? I would say yes. It gets easier when you learn to distinguish those portions of your time and life when you are learning about and combating, fighting this destruction, and those parts where you are living in your own world. You are not actively fighting. You are not even concerned with that world. I mean, you can't fight 24 hours a day, and there's no point fighting 24 hours a day. You're supposed to fight a corrupt world so that, according to objectivism, you can have a happy life. But if you spend your whole life, writing letters to the editor and sending leaflets, whatever it happens to be, and allow yourself no time for anything private, I think you're giving up a great deal of your personal life. But in any event, it won't get easier unless you leave it alone. I don't mean forever. It could be like a job, or it can be part-time. But you should, when there is no concrete or no issue that you think important to fight, that you can fight, as long as there is one and you have time, do it. But you should stop looking for continual crises to fight. It becomes almost a self-indulgence, a self-torture. You should go out of your way to avoid those things which are going to make you miserable when you know in advance that the chances are great that you're not going to have any significant impact. I go out of my way to wall myself off from assaults and attacks that I don't intend to answer and don't give a damn about, but don't want to hear in detail. And my assistant has a list of names. If that name appears anywhere in the email, whether from a friend or foe, we just delete it. So I don't have the awareness of how much I'm attacked on the internet because I have complete immunity from it. Only if I get death threats and call the FBI, then I have to pay attention. In other words, I try to create the best world I can and live in that, within career, marriage, friends, art, reading, etc. I finally got to the point where the New York Times was one of the things, instead of telling me about the world, that was most destructive of the world and most agonizing to read. And when I gave up that and started to read just the front page of a couple of other papers that were a little bit less vicious, I found it a much pleasanter breakfast. And I don't think I'm evading. I still have a podcast. Well, I'm retired now, but for many years I had public interaction. I fought all these battles, but even so, you've got to have a life. I think there was a scene, do you remember the scene where Galt first comes to Dagny and they're looking for him? He comes to her apartment, he's running from them, and she's worried, and he says, never think of, I can't quote it, but it's been so long since I read it. Never think of anything other than the positive. Fight them when you have to, and the rest, it's our world. And you have to have that attitude. It's your beautiful world, and someone is hammering on the door, and as and when you can, you shoot them, and then you go back to enjoying it.
Your mention of Bill Gates a moment ago made me wonder what you think of his recent statements about capitalism.
Well, you tell me what his recent statements.
A kinder, gentler capitalism.
No, I haven't heard about that, but Bill Gates has made incredibly bad left-wing statements from as far back as I can remember. The worst thing about him is the billions that he's giving away to charity, and obviously feels that that's his moral obligation. I have no admiration for him at all, except, that he went in a garage and had a great idea at one point. Now, at this moment that I'm speaking, what he's trying to do in taking over Yahoo, I think is valid. From what I know, and Google is the corrupt one for going to the government, but they both have gone to the government to get what they want, so they're both, at best, mixed economy businessmen. And I've heard more corrupt statements from Bill Gates than from the Google. You and Ayn Rand have both lectured on difficult topics to people that were sometimes unreceptive. Do you have any general tips on public speaking? Well, there's really only two things. You have to motivate the audience. If you say unreceptive, unless, they're just hostile and there's nothing you can do, it's primarily because they don't know why they should care about what you're doing. And you cannot do that in just a sentence or a paragraph. You have to tie it to their actual values so that they can see why they should learn what you're telling them. In my course on philosophy of education, I discussed that. The other thing is you've got to have a logical structure. They have to be able to understand why what you're saying follows as it does and continually why it carries out the promise of the motivation. And now there's a lot more. You can read my course on objective communication or philosophy of education, but I will add this. You asked for tips. There's lots of physical tips which I'll toss out to you, all of which I used in my years teaching. The whole thing is to stop a class from going to sleep or an audience. The great temptation of people listening, especially to difficult material, is to go to sleep, to tune it out. So anything you can do to stop that from happening is crucial. Now, one thing I developed is to say funny things, not prepared stories, but cracks or wisecracks, with the idea that every time a class laughs, you get about 35 seconds of consciousness. So you can jump in again and get a point. It's like a little piece of speed. Another thing is volume. Don't drone, but speak on the over loud side so that they can't miss what you're saying, rather than they have to strain to listen. I always like a room to be uncomfortably cold, because again, people go to sleep easy when it's warm. Another thing, I could go on, I guess I shouldn't waste the time, but one last thing. If you are reading a whole talk, you must hide that fact. You have to learn to have your fingers follow your script and just glance down to your finger, grab the next 10 words in your mind, look up, and then say them as though they're extemporaneous, sometimes adding an obvious phrase that couldn't have been written down, so that at the end of it, people do not know that you're reading. It's very essential if you're reading. And the only other thing I can tell you is interact with the audience if it's appropriate. Let them ask questions. Surprise them. Surprise also jolts people awake. For instance, you can stand in the front and looking to the left and call out the name of somebody on the right near the back, and just say, and therefore, Mr. So-and-so, what do you say to this? And once the class knows that that's about to happen, they pay attention for quite a while because they're afraid their name is coming next. And then in total desperation, what I once did is walk to the back of a room and give the whole lecture to the back of their heads. And they were totally silent and attentive because they didn't know what I was doing or seeing back there. Those are some tips, but you could write a whole book on what to do. I notice that your writing, as well as Ayn Rand's, does not employ politically correct, gender-inclusive language. You don't write he/she, his/her, etc. Why do you not conform to this convention? Because it is pure egalitarianism. The term man has always been the name of the species, not of any subdivision within it. And to suddenly say, or at least not exclusively of any subdivision, and to suddenly say, yes, but male and female is a very important distinction. And we don't want a word in there that derogates, we don't want to omit a word that would derogate the female. Well, I don't believe in the context of properly written language that the use of he and whatever in any way derogates the females, the status of females, whatever. But if you take that attitude, then you've got to have your pronouns a hell of a lot longer. You can't leave out color. So you have to write he-black/she-white crossed the street. And therefore, sure, we got both sexes and both colors. But what about, we need a few other things put in, like he-old-Buddhist/she-teenage-Sikh. If you put in all the, quote, important distinctions, you see the ridiculousness of it. This is a collectivist grammar. And of course, there would be big arguments as to the order of priority if we did it. Should it be he black or black he or she black? First, who comes first? When you have egalitarianism there's always destruction. And in this case, the destruction is to destroy the clarity of language, to simply propagandize for feminism while making communication that much more difficult. Now, the lengths to which some feminists will go to bring women into language and to declare that, our wording is what is the word they use? Chauvinistic, is unbelievable. I'll tell you just one. My daughter had a grade school teacher once who would not teach history by that name because she said, why is what we did his story? What about her story? And she thereafter taught herstory. And that's all her students were allowed. And you try to tell her, well, this comes from the Greek historia, she says nonsense. The kids today hear it as his story, and they shouldn't. So that makes just as much sense as her. If a being was so intelligent that the correct course of action was always clear to him, would that not be like a force too strong to resist? So such knowledge would determine every course of action for the creature, effectively negating its free will. Well, first of all, let me correct you. You couldn't say it knows the correct course of action because nothing would be correct anymore. The term wouldn't apply, just as it doesn't to a robot. Would I say it would negate it? Yes. If somehow it could grasp correct and incorrect. And it couldn't do anything but the correct, it knew the correct that blatantly, it would have to act accordingly. And that was Socrates' whole idea of virtue is knowledge. The idea was if you know the good, you'll have to do it. But in fact, that's not true because Ayn Rand's point is that you can know virtue 100%, but nothing can be that, blatant in your consciousness that you can't escape it, no moral issue, because of the faculty of evasion. If you have the faculty, the capacity of evasion, you can know out and out that something is unjust, it's evil, and it's dishonest, whatever, and you can rationalize, pretend, get drunk. So long as you have that capacity, knowledge will not force action. Only knowledge which is allowed to remain as knowledge. So this creature that you hypothesize is not a human being. Nor do we have any idea what would be a consciousness. Because this isn't a conceptual being. As we understand it, doesn't integrate. There's no choice. How this person knows correct and what is the standard of correct if it's an automaton. We can't think about this creature. What would Ayn Rand say of the flooding of our country with Mexicans? Now, he goes on with a number of economic issues, but I want to drop those and go on to culture, he says, is something. And most of white people's culture has been destroyed wherever the Mexicans go. Well, what is my view of immigration for Mexicans or anybody else? In principle, I hold it should be free. It is not a function of the government to prevent foreigners from coming into this country as they wish. The fact that you are born in or already live in this country does not entitle you to declare what should be done with the property and land that you don't own, or with the voluntary arrangements of other people. Nobody owns or controls what isn't owned or controlled by individuals. Now, I think it's proper for the government to restrict physical threats, known criminals, people with contagious diseases, foreign agents in time of war. But that's not the same thing as quotas for nationalities. Now, what causes the problem today is the welfare state. It's the handouts that are given to all the different immigrant groups as a part of having living here. And of course, people validly say they're taking my money, they're getting free welfare and free schools and free hospitals that I'm paying for, and that causes resentment. But there's only one solution to it, and that is not to ban immigration, but to reinstate capitalism. And that's the only practical solution anyway, because there's no way to seal the border, even if you took the whole budget and the entire military and stationed them all around from Canada and the water, etc., you still couldn't stop it. I mean, you're talking about so massive a territory that it's ridiculous for them to build a wall near Mexico while the agents of the immigration service are being continually subverted, bribed, and going over to the other side. It's just ridiculous, the whole thing. If you had capitalism, you would only attract a certain type of any culture, including of Mexican, the type that wanted to live the American mode of life. And that would mean the type that did fit into and promote the American culture. Now, as a matter of fact, I happen to know quite a number of Mexicans through the years, and a great number, all of them that I know are like this. They promote Mexican culture in the sense that they listen to Spanish radio stations. They like certain types of music. They like tequila more than vodka. But things like that are possible in every group, and that doesn't affect what is the substance of American culture. In fact, I think tequila is a great contribution. There seems to be a desire among objectivists to pin the status of romanticism and heroics onto art which is not romantic and onto people who are not heroes. Now, the questioner goes on to ask my opinion of several television and movie examples that he doesn't think are romantic, and what is my opinion? And since I'm not familiar with them, I can't say. But he wants to know what my views are on the subject of objectivists being too free to describe movies that they like as romantic. I completely agree with this questioner. Completely. People attach the term romanticism much too often to movies that have some element that you could say is good, however inessential or however peripheral, and that is a complete mistake. Romanticism means a definite kind of work with a certain kind of plot and certain kind of characters. You can't say the hero said something good, therefore it's a romantic movie. He said something hopeful and optimistic about man. That does not make a movie romantic. When I had my radio show, when I first started, people used to call in and say, praise a certain movie and say it was so wonderful and give some, what I didn't know out of context, but some, praise specific things in the movie. And I would say, well, I urge my listeners to go to this movie. It sounds really good. And then invariably, 2 weeks or whatever later, someone would call and say, you know what that person left out, and then would fill me with horrors. I was actually embarrassed. And pretty soon I made, as a rule, absolutely never agree with a listener about a movie that I haven't seen. They could still express their view, but I was neutral until I saw the movie. And the problem is that people don't approach movies, or those people don't approach movies from the point of view of an integrated philosophic context, or integrated aesthetic context. The problem is a lot of them are desperate to find something that is good and inspiring and benevolent, and so they drop the context of the total they seize on some one aspect. They focus on it. They love it. And the rest in their mind has the status of, oh, that's a side issue. It's negligible. It's really important. I actually heard one objectivist say that when one criminal shot another criminal, that was good because it implied free will. It implied the power of man and justice when one shot the other who asked for it. Now, that, of course, is a fantastic extreme. That's like saying when Jack Benny, the old comedian, used to say your money or your life, well, he was an advocate of free choice because he gave you a choice. You have to take any statement, any event, any character, any aspect of it within the total. And you can then say, well, X was good, but the movie as a whole was no good. Or it was a mixed movie. But what it is true what this questioner says, that there are people who extend to an entire movie an estimate that in fact they would, if they were scrupulous, apply only to some one aspect. Now, the perfect example of this fallacy I committed a long time ago, there was an actress named Anna Magnani, an Italian actress, who I admired, partly because she was very much like Ayn Rand in her manner and in her expression of emotion. And I went to a movie and saw her, and I just couldn't, I was just enraptured. I thought she was so terrific. And after the movie, I came back and Ayn Rand asked me, what did you think of the movie? I said, oh, it was wonderful. It was one of the most inspiring movies and so on. She said, well, I have to go and see it. She came back from the movie and she said, what is the matter with you? Are you crazy? And then she described the actual events of the movie and what happened, down to the bloody birth of sheep on a desolate farm. And I was mortified because I hadn't seen any of that. I just screened it out. I learned from that not to do it again. So you have to learn it also if you want to have an objective approach to movies or to art more broadly. Is it appropriate for a free government to help its free citizens during an emergency? No under Katrina and no under earthquakes, etc. The government function is not to protect you from nature, but to protect you from men. If you are free in a free country, you deal with these things on your own and in advance. You know that these things are going to happen. You make the preparations and finance in advance if you know you're living by dikes or in an area that's prone to wildfires or whatever. You have the team, the firemen, whatever. You have purchased the insurance. Or you don't live there. But you don't just go along, mind your own business, let the dikes wash away, and then say, I expect the government to come because I'm in trouble. And you see what a great job the government does in absolutely every case. In New Orleans, it still doesn't exist. The government is restricted to prevention of retaliation of force by men. Oh yeah, now here's a guy who reads something stated about me in Wikipedia and wants to know what my view is. And let me say in advance, please don't base a question on what's said about me in Wikipedia, because from what I am told, it bears little relationship to me. Apparently anybody can come and rewrite according to what they want. So, there's a lot of websites and people that want to rewrite in a negative way. So you can't believe about me. I think you could about Louis XIV, but not about people today. At least not controversial. Now the question comes down to, am I an interventionist or an isolationist in regard to foreign policy? And the answer is I am neither, because these two terms are anti-concepts. Not just invalid concepts, but anti-concepts. That means dishonest, epistemologically corrupt attempts to evade differences, to merge together two radically different things, and then take the value judgment that people have on one and get away with it on the other. Ayn Rand explains that in one of her articles about the time of the Goldwater election in regard to the term extremism, which was coined just to destroy his nomination. Now, intervention, as in interventionism, what action does internationalism, but they also call it internationalism or interventionism, what action? Well, it was coined in the World War II. The leftists wanted us to go in, and the people who did not want America plunged into a war where our self-interest was not involved were called isolationists. And the idea of this coinage was isolationist, that means ignoring the world, and that's obviously bad. Because ignoring the world would mean, well, you can't deal with it, you can't check your interests, you can't defend yourself, and therefore we have to look at the world and go and intervene, not just stand off. And what is intervention? Well, intervention is giving economic aid and military aid and taking part in battles and also taking part, of course, in self-defense. So intervention is intermixed. Self-defense, altruism, self-sacrificial military ventures, all of that comes under intervening, not being an isolationist, not, quote, ignoring. And ignoring means not just ignoring irrelevant conflicts, but ignoring any threats to yourself. So the alternative is either you give your country away to foreign countries, and that's the price of being concerned with defending yourself, or you're selfish and then you're going to die. It's such an absurd coinage, but of course it lasted. But now I don't think there's any longer any, quote, isolationists left. But imagine a foreign policy defined as, quote, I won't look at anything, or, quote, I'll go and do things to foreign countries. But that's the mentality that created those. If you're going to use the word intervene, the question is, intervene when? By war only, and when it's self-defense. But actually, you should just throw those two words out absolutely. In Ayn Rand's definition of capitalism, she says that all property is privately owned. Is that really true? For example, would the buildings and land that house the government, police force, and military be properly owned? Yes, they would be privately owned by a public corporation. Public just in the same way that General Electric and Toyota are public corporations. Private citizens would own shares, and the corporation would make possible and finance the land and the machinery. Who else would you have do it? I mean, when you say give it to the government is merely representatives of the people. Well, when you say the people, how are the people in general going to own? What does collective ownership mean? It doesn't mean anything. Somebody still has to make the decision of use and disposal. So there has to be specific individuals, and they have to hold the shares on the understanding of agreeing with certain principles, that they will not go against the policy of the elected representatives, etc. But nevertheless, the actual factual ownership would have to be theirs. And if no one would do it, And if no one wants the instruments of government, there's no government. But, that's not an existing phenomenon. Here's a question on romantic relationships. I am currently still in love with a woman who I am no longer in a relationship with. She's now involved with somebody else. I have a feeling of jealousy and hope things don't work out with them. Is this inconsistent with loving her? Shouldn't I want the best for her? My immediate answer would be no. It's not inconsistent because love is selfish. You want her, if you're in love with her, for you, not for anybody else, for the happiness and the fulfillment, the pleasure that you will get from her. So it's certainly natural, if once you break up, to think of how bad you feel and how much you wish she had stayed with you, and you hope she doesn't find anybody else like you. But if you leave her alone, if you don't go up and try to force yourself on her, after a while, you will come to accept that she did this for a reason, and you will move on, become independent, and at that point, you will wish her well, and you may very well say, yeah, she was really good in her way. She's not for me. You'll come to see, and your jealousy will fade, and you'll wish her well, assuming she broke up with you in a not hurtful, irrational way. What you will ultimately come to see is that if she does not love you, and she's turned to somebody else, she is not the one that is right for you. In the great majority of cases, unrequited love means that the people have different values, and that therefore, even if the one that's withdrawing were to throw herself into the relationship, you are not what she wants. Now, of course, if she just doesn't want you because she's promiscuous and wants anybody, again, if you're rational, she is not someone you want. You don't want to be wanted that way. So people can live with unrequited love. Now, in some cases, it's very difficult. Take Ayn Rand's very early story, The Husband I Bought, in which the woman is passionately in love with the man, and he appreciates her, but he doesn't see how great she is. She feels he has the same values, but he doesn't see it. That's a much more difficult situation, but she has to ultimately realize, well, if he doesn't see it, he's not the right man for me. Or take the situation of Dagny and Galt in relation to Reardon. Now, they have the same values, and he can feel, I am great, and she doesn't reciprocate a love she once had, but then he'd have to say to himself, does he understand why? And he sees why in certain respects, Galt would be stronger, more self-confident, know his own direction better. So even though Reardon is a full hero, he can understand why she, given everything, prefers Galt, and is in that way wouldn't be right for him, not once she knows that Galt exists. Even if he were equal in moral stature to Galt, there wasn't any, and not only in moral, but in practical achievement, he was indistinguishable as a hero. If Dagny preferred Galt on purely personal reasons, he's her style, or he's her unique combination of interests and values, it would still be the case that Reardon would have to say, well, given that, she is not the one for me. If she wants something different from me, even if I have all these values, and she appreciates them, obviously I am not the one. One way or the other, if a person doesn't choose you, you have to come to the conclusion ultimately, maybe I wish they had, I saw so much in them, but they're not right for me. And when you learn to live with that and accept it, you are then free to say, unless the person was, a tramp, you are then free to say, yeah, now I get a little perspective. I wish her the best. She's looking for what she needs in life. I'm looking for what I have. But don't expect that perspective the day you break up or the month you break up. What role should a number of different government agencies play in the objectivist government? And then he lists a number. My answer is the government has three functions. That's the objectivist view. To protect individual rights from force or the threat of force. And then I would go through all the agencies you list, just in a word. Intelligence agencies, yes. In regard to force, foreign or crime domestic. And that doesn't mean that everything the CIA or the FBI do today is proper, but in principle, to have someone try to find out what's going on without violating the rights of citizens can be considered mandatory. Now you go on. Health? No, absolutely. Government has nothing to do with health. The Department of State? Yes. Some is legitimate insofar as the government deals with other governments. Defense? Yes, for obvious reasons. Energy? No, for obvious reasons. Homeland security? Absolutely no. That is a total disaster. Homeland security is an institutionalization of the idea we cannot defeat the enemy and live free of threat, so we're accepting a permanent, unbeatable threat to our security as a fact of life. We're not going to go on the offensive and wipe the slate of enemies. We're going to figure out a way of living with them forever. That is the worst, most cowardly, and to the Mideast hostile countries, it says, go right ahead. And you see, of course, how effective that department is with different colors for different, different moods of the administrator. Obviously, no for the health, education, and welfare, all three. No for the Labor Department. No for agriculture. No for commerce. No for interior. I don't know anything they do. They should certainly not have anything to do with parks and forests, interior lands. Treasury, I think you could justify on a modest scale because the government needs money to function, but not the Federal Reserve or any manipulation of the currency. The Treasury should be like an accountant, keeping track of what the government has spent and how much is left. Now, that's just a quick hit and run of the departments you mentioned, but I'm certainly not going to go into a whole discussion of that. A question I've been asked a number of times. What do you think of the plan for a mosque in New York City near Ground Zero? Isn't it private property and therefore protected by individual rights, and no one has the right to interfere? Now, I don't take concrete political issues like this, but in this case, it is an issue of such ramifications that I just can't ignore it. I also am going to lie to you or deceive you in this way, not in the content of what I say, but in the manner. Left to my own devices, I would be enraged and spout off all the way through my answer on the wickedness of the people who believe this, or the non-knowledge of the people who agree with them. But I asked for the questions, and therefore, if I take it when nobody forced me, I gotta be calm, just as if it was any other question. So do not let my manner deceive you as to my opinion, my evaluation. Let's start with property rights. Property rights are limited and they are contextual. You cannot do anything you want with property, even though it is yours. Not if its ramifications objectively entail a threat to the rights of others. You can't build a bomb in your home. You can't even build a big bonfire in your backyard legitimately, because the principle of rights is that property rights are a derivative of life as the standard, and there can be no right to threaten anyone's life, nor indeed to threaten anyone's property. Second, rights are contextual. In any situation where metaphysical survival is at stake, all property rights are out. You have no obligation to respect property rights. The obvious classic example of this is, which I've been asked 100 times, you swim to a desert island, you had a shipwreck, and you get to the shore, and the guy comes to you and he says, I got a fence all around this island. I found it. It's legitimately mine. You can't step onto the beach. Now, in that situation, you are in a literal position of being metaphysically helpless. Since life is the standard of rights, if you no longer can survive this way, rights are out, and it becomes dog eat dog, or force against force. Now, don't assume that any unsatisfied need therefore puts you in this metaphysical category. For instance, you're very poor and you're hungry. Well, you need food. But in a capitalist society, or even in a mixed economy, that is not a metaphysical deprivation. There's always all sorts of choices and ways in a free society for you to gain food. Always. All right, now let's apply this to the foreign relations issue. The context today is that we are at war, and not a Cold War, a real war. We are facing widespread terrorism sponsored by a number of governments with tremendous popular backing in virtually every Mideast Islamic country. Even Turkey, the one priding itself on its secularism, has now gone Islamic. Now, the United States response, the Western response to this, is a continuation of the appeasement that was started back in the 50s under Eisenhower when Iran seized a Western oil company. The Americans, the British, and the Israelis, as I remember, launched an attack to try to reclaim it, and or at least the British and the Israeli did, and Eisenhower vetoed it. And since that point, there's been more and more and more craven appeasement by the West, and across 50 years, the audacity and the scope of outrage of the Islamic world, I mean by that the activists, the militants, the terrorists, and their countless followers, they have continually upped the deaths, the assaults, the horror, while the U.S. has continually upped its appeasement. And of course, the appeasement includes the pretense of a war, which consists of bombing empty fields and letting innocent American soldiers be slaughtered because we mustn't harm the lampposts or the people down the street. The government under this present individual is not even allowed to use the word terrorist anymore, let alone to suggest that Muslims are involved. He's just continuing Bush's policy. Bush's first speech after 9/11 was that, of course, Islam and Islamics and people who believe in Islam have nothing whatever to do with it. It's just a tiny lunatic fringe. And so Bush had a non-policy in the same way that Obama does. And since there's no enemy, and it's correct, terrorist is a stupid word because terror is a tactic. It's not an idea. So we have no identified enemy, and no war nothing except, and you notice that if anything happens, anything at all, that would suggest some kind of violent act, the first thing that the authorities say is it's not terrorism. It's not a foreign policy incident. And then when they finally discover, they say, well, it's an exceptional case, and we have to investigate, and we have to have a special trial in New York City, which will take 13 years, and we have to give him lawyers. It's just historically unbelievable that the worse the enemy becomes, the weaker the United States becomes. Now, it should be obvious that there is no end to this, no final result, and not too far from now in time, before there will be Islamic devastation or even takeover of a paralyzed United States. Now, I know that seems fantastic, and it's still fantastic today, but ask yourself in 1990, if you were alive then, what people thought the reaction would be to 9/11, and then what it actually was. You just project by degrees what's going to happen. Now, the proper reply to the whole evil of terrorism, Islamic fundamentalism, if you want to call it that, would be to state the right morality firmly, the morality of the Founding Fathers, declare war on the appropriate state. Now, that's a different topic, but I would say you have to start with Iran, give notice, and bomb Tehran as a beginning. But we can't do that. But right now the question is, what should we do in this case? Now, in my view, in this context, any objective sign, not what could be subjectively taken one way or the other, but any objective sign of our weakness, it is immoral and catastrophic for Americans to permit it insofar as they could stop or weaken the effort to it. And the Mosque is absolutely a textbook example of this. There is only one objective message. Now let me give you an analogy if it's not self-evident. Japanese strike Pearl Harbor. We declare war. Japan, the Japanese are then given a large spread of land in Pearl Harbor to build a temple celebrating, I don't care what, the Japanese superiority or Shinto peacefulness, I don't care what. Now, if you can even conceive of that as justified because of, quote, property rights, unquote, then I say you haven't a clue what property rights or individualism or objectivism is saying. Because what permitting that amounts to is roll over, kick me, kill me, I have nothing to say. If someone down the street lobbed grenades into your home that you were renting, and the police wouldn't do a thing, and you fled, and he buys the property and builds the Church of Home bombing on your land, would you say, well, I mean, it's his property? And don't think that's a false analogy. Now, some of you are going to ask, well, but this is unfair to the Muslims who are innocent. You're talking about how we should deal with the terrorists. And I say that's irrelevant. Even if there were innocent Muslims involved in this mosque, the alternative we have is their right to property versus our right to survive as the only property defender left in the West. And there can be no question about what the proper choice is here. I don't, by the way, believe that the great majority of Muslims are innocent. I think they are passive because it's very rare to hear any anti-terrorist voice. There are some, but very rare to hear there's nothing to suggest a, quote, schism within the Islamic movement. So I don't even consider that. Plus, I add what I've said in past shows. Here we have to go by probability, which is not collective judgment. I've talked in past shows already about why it is legitimate for New York taxi drivers, black and white, to hesitate or refuse to accept fares going to Harlem. So you can check that out. Now, I can't resist taking a second with regard to this issue of the Ground Zero Mosque. I'm going to read you two quotes without comment from the New York Post of when? June 19 this year. Quote, the imam behind plans to build a controversial Ground Zero Mosque yesterday refused to describe Hamas as a terrorist organization. Quote, the issue of terrorism is a very complex question, unquote, he told our interview. I have no more to say about what about the innocent Muslims. Now, if you ask me in conclusion, well, what then should properly be done? Obviously war, but I mean in regard to this issue, I would say any way possible permission should be refused, and if they go ahead and build it, the government should bomb it out of existence, evacuating it first, with no compensation to any of the property owners involved in this monstrosity. A nice little example would be Howard Rourke is relevant here. I want to just conclude by saying that I'm doing these podcasts for nothing but the enjoyment of talking to young people about important issues. I am not here to have a heart attack. So please don't send any more questions like this. I will not answer them. Thank you.
Dr. Peikoff has asked me to state, in case anyone misinterpreted, that the blowing up of a building mentioned near the end is an action, which, like all foreign policy issues, can properly be taken only by a government. He in no way suggests or condones private action in this issue.
Here's an interesting question, never asked of me. Is narcissism contrary to objectivist principle? Well, I have to say first, I always liked that myth. I always took it as a great expression of egoism. And I think I went out of my way to end my first book by reference to Narcissus. So to me, it has totally positive connotation. But now I looked it up in the dictionary. And this is the definition, which sounds like it's a good definition. Erotic gratification derived from admiration of one's own body or mind. Now, you see from that definition that most people today denounce narcissism because it is self-admiration, self-love, self-esteem. They even define that now as a sickness. And there's a huge assault on narcissism because they think that way they're getting at selfishness. Admiration of yourself is certainly, it's almost mandatory that you earn it and that you feel it. But this is the point. Usually you take it for granted, your mind and your body, your skills and your achievements. You don't, wake up and say, God, I'm so thin, or God, I'm so smart. That's you. Now, of course, if you have some special achievement on a given day, you can gaze at it and take pleasure in it. But in the normal course of affairs, you're looking out at the world. And you're not focused inward as a general thing. And they're implying by this narcissism is an inward orientation as a way of life, that your whole focus is on admiration of yourself versus the world. Now, I say that there is maybe degrees of this. I can see, standing in a mirror, reading a book or of your own or something like that. And I don't think there are a way to define degrees. But if you have to stay and stand in the mirror all day, and you get much more out of that than looking at somebody else, I think you have a problem. Now, what about the issue of it being erotic gratification? Well, sex is certainly a celebration of your values. But in its essence, sex is celebration of values in reality as embodied in a person other than yourself. Now, Ayn Rand, you have to read her or read Opar for why this is the nature of sex, why the experience of self and life that you can get from sex is not possible to just looking at yourself in the mirror. Another person appropriately chosen is essential. And even in masturbation, people imagine, they fantasize. They don't do it typically just in relation to themselves. So I would want to ask if any significant amount of your erotic gratification comes from just contemplating yourself. I would want to ask why. I'm not a psychologist, but it would make me think there's something peculiar, some kind of escapism, some kind of retreat from reality. But I'm not a psychologist. I can't comment on that. In Europe, nudity is the natural state. Nude saunas, parents running around nude with their children, the entire family nude and totally indifferent. Is there a rational basis for not being comfortable with public nudity? Well, let's just take nudity as a concept, being nude. Obviously, that in the appropriate context is a tremendous value. And their objectivism agrees totally with the Greeks and with the Renaissance. When they portray man or woman, they don't do it, in jockey shorts or a Victoria's Secret bra. That it is the metaphysical value of the body, the flaunting of the physical, that is involved in nudity. Now, if you do it as a person, though, a certain context, I think, is appropriate. You're doing it as then an act of intimacy. It's like you are stressing your relation to the person by saying, you are an exception to my normal behavior. Everything about me is going to be bared to you. I want you to know every value, and my nudity is certainly, my nude body is certainly a crucial value. So in that sense, nudity, flaunting nudity, is highly desirable. That doesn't mean you always have to make love without the clothes on. It means that nudity as such is a tremendous value. There were Puritans who had a sex life, so to speak, and at the end of their life, the man did not recognize the woman's body because he had never seen it. There was just a little hole that he used. That is totally corrupt anti-nudity. And in fact, that was the Christian attitude. That's why they went around smashing the genitals of Greek and Roman sculpture. Now, I don't think it's appropriate for parents to run around nude with their children for this reason. That it's not that type of relationship. But in the right context, I think it's great. Now, you say, talk about public nudity. The only case I can think of, which strikes me, at least offhand, as being obviously proper and good, was the Greek conduct of gymnastics, where there was a strong worship of the body and a real bonding of the gymnasts, and where the whole thing was oriented around, the what is it, healthy mind and a healthy body, and they actually had a worship of the body, and from that point of view, they were expressing it. So if you had a context in which the body was offered and accepted, even in a non-sexual context, as a value to be worshipped, let's say a model in a sculpture studio, then nudity is great. The bad thing about nudity is treating it casually. It's treating it as though, well, it has no significance, like treating sex as an itch. So now in saunas, things of that kind, I would say, it pretty much doesn't come out, because in the saunas I've been at, and the steam baths and so on, men don't flaunt anything. It's usually a practical measure so that they don't get burned in the wrong place. Now, I very much doubt whether today, even to objectivists, because of the influence of Christianity over everyone, we can have the attitude of the Greeks or the pagans. I think the vast majority of people have a sense of discomfort, or the ones who do it with a kind of defiance, showing off, exhibitionism, voyeurs, etc. The Greeks were not that way. But the idea of being able to take the body with the kind of innocent, almost naive admiration, devoid of sex and devoid of cynicism, you just can't find it that I know of in the modern world. I was taken by a group once to a nude beach in San Diego. And in principle, I thought, well, I approve of the body, etc. But when I got there, leaving aside the way those bodies look, they're not exactly the kind that you could have a response to. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't, because the feeling was, these are not people who share the same attitude toward nudity that I do. We don't have any kind of bond. So as I see it now, it's appropriate only in a love or in an art type of relationship. Here's a light one. What kind of computer games do you like and why? Well, I used to play Ms. Pac-Man, but I have no reflexes now, so I'm reduced to word games, card games, and board games. And basically, I like Free Cell, I like Backgammon, I like Bookworm. I'm sure they all seem boring to you, but someday you'll reach my point of life and might find more interest to them. Why do I do these? Well, some of them involve skill. I'm very competitive, especially in backgammon. I've got a set made by a German company, which I'm convinced was made by a Nazi company because I can't win against it. So some sadists put this together. I mean, I guess that's a joke, but it does occur to me. I try to win. But I think the more common reason for playing is just to fill in time gaps, usually when I'm waiting for someone to get dressed, which happens frequently. I've read all of Ayn Rand's nonfiction and loved it. Her ideas have changed my life dramatically, but I'm not able to get through Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. What does this mean? Well, as tactfully as I can, I'll tell you that Ayn Rand was asked that question several times. And she said if there was a division like that, she would like the person who would like the novels but not the nonfiction, but not the reverse. That if they liked the nonfiction but not the fiction, that means the nonfiction is in some forms floating. It's not integrated to the values that move the person. It may even be antagonistic to those values. Whereas a person that likes the novels responds to and embraces the universe. They implicitly responds to those values, even if explicitly he's not interested in ideas or doesn't like them, doesn't see the connection. So it's like, what does it reveal about the two types? Now, there can be other reasons why you don't like novels, but this is what she said. Now, I've had a number of questions about immigration. So I'm going to try to cover a few high points here. Your main question is, what is the proper government attitude toward immigration? Now, in a capitalist society, a laissez-faire society, I would say the government has no function whatever, and foreigners should be free to visit here, move here, acquire property, whatever. The principle of individual rights does not apply only to citizens, but also to foreigners, since they are human. Of course, foreigners can't engage in force, but assuming that they trade or whatever, they live here without the use of force, then everybody benefits and there's no problem. I just say parenthetically, the government has the right to monitor for and prevent the immigration objectively provable, physical, harmful, in actuality or an objective threat to the citizens, to the country. So, for instance, someone who bears a contagious physical disease, a known criminal, a potential member of an enemy at war, all these are absolutely subject to governmental investigation and a refusal to let them in. But those are not cases we're generally talking about in this question. Now, as I say, that would be applicable in a capitalist society. But what about in today's society, which is an advanced welfare state, which offers many, many free, unearned services to the, quote, needy, wherever they come from. Obviously, in medicine, in hospitals, in schools, in education. And there's no question, factually, about this. There are no more, for instance, emergency rooms in California in hospitals, probably in the whole country, because they're filled with, largely with immigrants who get free medical care. Now, that is unfair that we have to pay for additional freeloaders over and above the ones that are here. But the Supreme Court has come down firmly that any welfare benefits dispensed to citizens have to be dispensed to immigrants as well. It's also true that this, in the earlier days in the 19th century, because immigrants were offered no special incentive other than what they could gain by their own work, we got a certain category of immigrant, hardworking, self-sufficient, independent. Today, while I stress you are still getting quite a number of these high-quality people, you are also getting a large mass of people attracted by the welfare state and the free handouts. And those people, as is obvious, are the opposite of individualistic And they either start or more probably join these cultural movements of their particular original nation or ethnicity and attempt to have their own ethnic standards imposed by law on this country. As in California schools, I don't know how many languages they have to teach in. It's a big battle in California. Everything is required to be bilingual, etc. Now, this is completely wrong, but it is unavoidable if a mass comes in to a welfare state for that reason. That is precisely the mentality that will do so. So there is an unavoidable inherent contradiction here. It's not my contradiction, it is the contradiction of the policy of the country. On the one hand, it is valid to have foreigners. They have a right to travel and settle freely. Borders are not a proper barrier. But on the other hand, the citizens of this country have a right to private property. And now, in taking the side of the citizens, I recognize that many American citizens are much worse parasites, probably, than the worst immigrants. That doesn't change the fact that the issue, as we have to decide it, is the foreigner's right to travel versus citizens' right to their property. Now, the only solution would be free immigration with no welfare state. But the politicians obviously won't do this because the greater the illegal immigrants, the greater the necessity or the seeming necessity for our politicians not to touch them because they want the vote. So in the total context, I accept the anti-immigration viewpoint, except I quickly add it's really useless in the long range because you cannot safeguard the U.S. border of thousands of miles, combined with the fact that you can never get political motivation of the government to do so, even under the most conservative regime, because the illegal immigrants are way too big as a pressure group. So we are put in this position. What are the citizens to do if the federal government has abdicated and they're being robbed? I say in a case like that, you must choose the citizens. This is where selfishness comes in. It's our lives versus theirs. We don't want it to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way, but it has been forced on us that that is the way. And now we come to what can any particular state do since the federal government has abdicated, has basically resigned in perpetuity? What if you live in a state which is infested with illegal immigrants who are tied to criminal cartels? And you find that near your borders or even further in, there's an increase in crime, an increase of murder. It is increasingly unsafe. What are you supposed to do? Say, oh, we'll wait for Obama or the next useless Republican to do something about it? Obviously, we cannot. So I agree 100% with Arizona, with their law. And remember, counter to all the lies, they do not say you go up to any Hispanic on the street and interrogate him. It's only if they have a grounds to stop an automobile or citizen on the grounds of suspicion of some improper action. But to call this racism is nonsense. If you have evidence that there are a greater number in X group than Y committing a certain crime, you have every right to selectively focus, what they call, quote, profiling, to try to determine if there's no other way to do so, which is a given individual, a person committing the evil or not. Now, for example, New York cab drivers, white and black alike, generally refuse to take a black fare to Harlem. And it's not racism, it's that the probability is strongly that if they get to Harlem, they will be robbed, whereas if they go to Staten Island or Queens, they won't. That is not a collective judgment. To act on real probability is not a collective judgment. Now, of course, not all people who live in Harlem are guilty. Even quite a number, many, the majority. It's still true that it's much more likely that going there will cause you trouble, and you're perfectly rational. It is not collectivism. You're not saying this man is bad. You're saying, on the basis of the evidence, I don't want to take the chance. And the same exactly applies to Mexicans in Arizona. I was going to give you some of the horror stories that go on at the border in Arizona, but I will stop there. If a person holds the right standard of self-esteem, namely rationality, and consistently acts according to that standard, he's morally perfect. Is it possible for him to still feel a lack of self-confidence as a result, or self-esteem, as a result of psychological or psycho-epistemological thinking problems? And I say yes. You can be perfectly rational and act in that accordingly, and nevertheless feel a lack of self-esteem to an extent. Because self-esteem in essence amounts to you have the conviction that you can metaphysically deal with reality and succeed. Now, being rational is necessary to that, but it is no guarantee of success. If you have problems from the past, contradictions to your later ideas, and you don't know how to solve them, then at that point you can't be fully convinced of your ability to deal with reality, because you know there's some unclearness, you sense there's some confusion, some ambivalence. So you have to uproot that. Doesn't make you immoral. It doesn't make you, self-doubting to walk around and say, "Oh, poor me, I'm rotten." But it does lead, in certain situations, to a degree of uncertainty. You have to have a consistency on the issues that count, subconsciously as well as consciously, before you can have an unbreached self-esteem. Is there any validity to the popular term sociopath? Yes. That, by the way, used to be the term psychopath. In other words, something wrong with your psychology, with your relation to your mind, your psyche. But in our period, of course, society has superseded the mind. So now the problem is described as a problem with society. But in either case, what it designates is a real criminal phenomenon, a total amoralist, someone devoid of any concern for moral values, to the extent that they feel no guilt and no shame, no matter how horrible and criminal their behavior. This is essentially a psychological phenomenon. So far as I know, there has to be something wrong with you over and above misuse of free will to reach this utter pathological state. But it does exist, and I may say it's beyond just criminals. There are nihilists today in our society, in our culture, who revel in the destruction of values in their field. I'm sure you know some of the progressive educators, the non-representational artists, the egalitarians in politics. You could call them psychopaths. But in their case, or sociopaths, but in their case, you can't blame psychology. That is an issue of their conviction. A military question. If we tell our soldiers to focus on doing the work they love, as Rourke does, wouldn't winning a war become irrelevant? Because according to objectivism, all that matters is if the soldiers love their jobs. Well, that's all very fine, but if they love their jobs, what is their job? A job has a purpose if it's a rational job. You're trying to accomplish something. There's some values that are at stake. It's not just the technical skill of the actions involved. It's the fact that that technique and those actions are directed toward a certain achievement. So if you're a soldier, before you talk about loving your job, you have to know that loving your job is to win the war, assuming there is a war. So you learn all the skills involved with that in mind, and that's what you love to do. Now, for instance, there's a situation today, which I heard discussed at the Air Force Academy. There are some, I can't give you the technical terms, but there are some bombs that can either be dropped by airplane at great risk to the pilot over some hostile territory, or sent by remote control from perfectly safe territory. And cadets were asked, which would you rather do? Carry the bomb live or push the remote button? And the great majority said they would rather carry the bomb live, even at risk to their lives. Well, of course, these were kids who wanted the thrill of flying. But if they tried your method of justifying it and saying, well, I love bombs, that's my work, apart from the results, even though the remote might be the thing that would win the war, then they would be completely wrong. They would be loving the wrong thing, and it would be wrong by the standard of what the goal is. Creative work has a purpose, not just its performance. You could just as well say, what about the doctors under Nazism who worked diligently to remove perfectly healthy organs from bodies of some of the victims in the concentration camps? They loved their work without reference to what was the purpose. In this case, it was no purpose other than torture. Why was a great mind like Ayn Rand unable to catch the evil characters among her one-time associates in the act? Here again, I think I've answered this a number of times. Judging people is the hardest intellectual task there is. In my opinion, it still is the hardest task. And Ayn Rand, at the end of her life, told me that she knew less about people at the end than she thought she knew at the beginning. Simply because they are so bewildering, inconsistent. She went generally by their avowed statements and actions, not by their emotional projections or vibrations, although she tried to pick that up, but she tried to go by what she could tell objectively. And the problem is that there are great actors. They don't all go on stage that can take over the ideas of a philosophy, grasp exactly how to formulate them. They don't in any way sound like a parrot, and you can see them on the stage and you would swear this man 100% understands these ideas, completely integrated into his life. It's inconceivable that this is an act, and yet it is an act. Now, how one ferrets this out, especially if you don't know the private life of the person, I do not know. Now, sometimes Ayn Rand would give the benefit of the doubt, on the grounds that it's possible that this is of value. Sometimes that proved to be a mistake. I mean, if there was nothing definite, some seemingly good quality. Sometimes the evil, like a virus, nourished itself because someone who was considered, really honest and rational would vouch for someone who would then carry on the act, and it was a whole self-replicating chain. I think another problem was everybody necessarily, to some extent, projects that others are like themselves. And if she heard someone clearly and so on present ideas, she couldn't imagine, at least for quite a while in her life, that they didn't mean it. Now, I learned from her and from experience never to go by what people say. I have seen people say how much they love Atlas Shrugged, and doesn't mean anything at all. If I hear that, it's just the same as if somebody said, a stitch in time saves nine. It has no meaning to me at all. I rather tend to go by my impression when I meet somebody, if I like them or not, unless I see something obvious which I hate, and then pursue in a casual way from that basis if I can try to get some idea, but not just their statements of agreement with objectivism, which I simply discount. And if I can't get any sense, I just say, forget it. On the whole, I regard this whole issue as unknown to me. And Ayn Rand once said that psychology, or judging people, is in the state today that physics was at the time of Thales. We have a few observations and no clue thereafter. According to objectivism, happiness proceeds from the achievement of one's values. But does this mean that any values will do it as long as they are rational values? Yes, it does mean that, but it means rational in the full context. Not rational in the sense of food is a value, so I can go and rob the grocery store and expect to be happy. Rational in the full context means what life is the standard, all the principles and virtues, etc., that requires. But within that framework, if values are thus defined, certainly any rational values, and there's many options within that framework, will lead to happiness. And then the questioner goes on, or do you agree with Aristotle that in order to lead a happy life, there are certain definite values you need to obtain, such as friends, healthy children, certain material standard, etc. Well, it's not an either or. All of these that you mentioned are rational. They're all part of sustaining man's life qua man. I've discussed in O-Part the importance of friends. Obvious that we need a material standard. These are things that should be valued. So you seem to imply by this question that either you have definite values or you have rational values. But what you should have is definite values chosen by reason. And Aristotle, for the most part, did just exactly that. Can one say that to be born with brains is an issue of luck? And the argument being, you've got a great value without any effort or action on your part, versus the guy next door, let us say, just has an average brain. And wouldn't you rather be the guy with the good brain than the bad one? Didn't you get the better deal and it was just luck? And this other guy was in a position where it was unfair that he was saddled with this inferior brain. Now, let's get rid of unfair. The purpose of moral judgment, including just, unjust, fair, unfair, is only to estimate and direct human choice, anyone's choice. It has nothing to do with evaluating natural facts. If you fall off a mountain, the fact of falling is not unfair. Now, it may be irrational of you to have, gone up that high without precautions. And we could say that's irrational. And if you took your baby in your arms, we could say that's unjust. But you cannot say nature is, you can't say I was unlucky that the law of gravity applied to me. Luck and non-luck does not come within the sphere of any moral evaluation. If, for instance, again, there is a disease, a plague that is striking a country, and a lot of people get it and some don't, even though they take the same precautions, you cannot say it is unfair that I got it and he didn't. And therefore, we should equalize the situation by whatever, cutting off my leg to compensate for his double amputation. Luck applies to what is outside your choice and therefore is outside by that fact of moral judgment. Now, in any event, even if you get a good brain, that is not of any use if you simply let it idle. So the brain gives you a potentiality, but that's all it gives you at birth. And it's been estimated that something like 90% of our brain capacity is unused. So the real issue here is not how much capacity, but do you use what is in your capacity? And that is an issue of free will. Further, I want to add, if you are a moral person and you do use your brain to your capacity, that will not affect your happiness. Not if you conceive happiness in the objectivist sense as against the satisfaction without effort of any yearning you have. And the example of this is, for instance, Eddie Willers and Dagny in Atlas Shrugged, or Mike and Rourke in The Fountainhead. There is no implication that Mike, for instance, is doomed to a semi-happy life because he's not a hero or a genius on the level of Rourke. Your happiness is the achievement of your consistent code of values. And if your code is less demanding, that still means, if it's within your capacity, that the product of achieving your values will be full happiness within what you can even experience as happiness. Which authors of popular fiction do you recommend? I know that I and other objectivists would appreciate as long a list as you are prepared to make. Well, I've got this question time and again. I always intend to go to my library and make a long list, but I never have the time or strength to do it. But what I decided I will do is name some authors whom I have all the works of or most of the works of. Because if I like certain books of an author, I get all the rest on the assumption that there'll be something good. And that is usually true. Now, I tell you in advance, most of these people do not write romantic novels. What I like about their books, about some of their books anyway, is either they have an interesting, sometimes suspenseful story, or they have a character, not necessarily, but sometimes a hero, but at minimum a character that I sympathize with and hope for. And they also have a style, and by that I mean nothing beautiful and so on. I mean, can I read it? Put it this way, any fiction book, I read the first page, and some I have no difficulty reading in the way the words are put together. And others are contorted, or I don't exactly get it. It's not right on the point, so I go back. If I have trouble at all, if I can't sail through, I never read that book. So if you understand, I have a lesser standard. This is not objectivist literature, but there's still books that give me a certain pleasure. The analogy would be, it's not Rachmaninoff, it's not Tchaikovsky, But there's a lot of composers or popular pieces that you can enjoy without it reaching that state. Now, given that whole, see where my list starts here. All right, this is just in no order as it occurred to me. Sinclair Lewis, way back in the 20s. His best book is Arrowsmith, but you might like most Elmer Gantry, which is his expose of televangelists. It's not television, but preachers who stormed the country trying to convert. Lewis was an atheist. Here's an excellent writer is Neville Shute, Nevilshute. I have never read a bad book by him, and he's got 30, 40 of them. He's Australian. His best, I think, is Trustee from the Tool Room. And then there's Somerset Maugham, Maugham, and his most famous is his autobiography, but a fictionalized form, Of Human Bondage. And then there is John O'Hara, and his most famous was, it's a perfect, beautiful presentation of Malevolent Universe. It's short, so if you want to get that, it hits you between the head. Appointment in Samara, Samara. Of course, Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind. Oh, there's so many more. These are just from the top of my head. Hans Kirst, Kirst, who wrote about Germany in the 40s, and he mostly what happened under the Nazis. And his best book by far is called Soldiers' Revolt. It's a dramatization of the Stauffenberg conspiracy, if you know it. I was crying strongly on the last page of that. So has a really, really intriguing character. And then Saul Stein, Stein, his best book is The Magician, a beautiful indictment of lawyers. And then I'll give you just a couple of science fiction. Well, my favorite science fiction is Frederick Brown, The Mind Thing. And I'll just mention, I haven't given you any short stories, but I'll just mention one collection of short stories, which is really unique. Nightmares and Geezenstacks, Geezenstacks. That's a collection of stories, short, one more brilliant than the other. And I was praising it to Ayn Rand, and she said, let me see. And I said, well, just read the very last story, which is half a page. She said, half a page? What can you do? She started to read it, and she got through about 5 sentences, and she burst out laughing. She thought, that is so clever. So go to the last page of that book, if you get it. Then I just mentioned the name of 2 others whom I like, but I'm not going to give you titles. Isaac Asimov, Asimov, and Orson Scott Card, Card. Now in Card, be sure you get the science fiction and not the pro-Mormon, because he's written a number of books dramatizing, Mormonism. So that should hold you for a while. Is there a difference between the principle of self-ownership and the principle of individual rights? Or put it another way, is there a difference between saying that someone is the owner of his own life and that he has a right to life? Yes, there's definitely a difference. Ownership is a concept that implies a relationship between you and an external object. There's the owner and the object possessed. How can you own yourself? Who is the owner that is doing the owning of the owner? I mean, this is nonsensical. There's somebody over and above me that is me that's owning my body and soul. Or my body and soul are owning. What does the owning consist of? Properly, ownership as a concept applies only to external property. You own physical objects that you can use and dispose of. You don't own your own freedom. And this whole idea came in many, probably generations ago from very bad, frightened conservatives who thought that The safest thing in our society to defend individualism is make it all an issue of property rights. And therefore, individual right to liberty and so on is just a form of property rights. You just own yourself. That was in the days when, property rights were considered sacrosanct, but life and liberty were vague abstractions. But this is a completely wrong inversion. It makes property the primary instead of the derivative. What about, big jump here, what about the unavoidable choice of having to settle for less in romantic relationships in terms of finding someone that has everything you want that also wants you? To what degree do you believe it is necessary to settle for the greatest amount of value while also agreeing and conceding that you're not going to have some other values that are important to you? Well, I don't think it's a matter of degree. You couldn't measure, say, well, I got 3/4 of the values. It's an issue of your hierarchy. And it has to be your personal hierarchy if you're talking about a romantic relationship, not the objectivist hierarchy, or not the personal hierarchy of an objectivist hero. You have to decide what you need as a man if you are to positively enjoy, love, and sleep with a woman across time, versus what turns you off, what don't you like so much that even if you had everything else, you don't want it. Or what is gray. It's okay, but it's not going to be make or break it. We put it in terms of legal terms. You have to know what you want and what is a deal breaker. Whether that deal breaker is something there or something absent. Something you want that's not there or something you don't want that's there. And that varies from person to person, but that's where your hierarchy comes in. What is essential? And I think that word deal breaker is helpful. I heard that from someone who said once that he thought this woman he was with was great, but there was a certain kind of sexual activity that he liked or she wouldn't engage in, and that was a problem. And I said, what was the problem? He said, is it a deal breaker or not? So he had to go and decide. Now, she may have all the good qualities, but if that, in his view, is what makes a sexual relationship, and without that, he doesn't want it, no one can come and say, well, objectivism doesn't say that that particular practice is essential. No, I mean, if it's really ludicrous, then he's cutting out a lot of good choices. But, there's a lot of latitude. Love, in the sense of 100% union of values, where you get everything, is not necessary for a relationship. If you find that, great, but it's not indispensable. But what you have to look for, and this would be my answer to your question, is 100% of the indispensable. Not just quantity, not the greatest quantity of value. It may be 2 values are indispensable and 20 are nice, but you could do without them. So that's what you have to look for. That's what you have to decide. And it varies from person to person. And it is not easy. And you might, come to a decision, and then later you meet someone and say, so-and-so is really better, a better value than this one. I'm going to change my opinion. But you have to go by, what you know at a certain time. Now, this question, I assume, comes from a young person. I don't feel comfortable in my own skin. I'm unhappy with my body, and this leads to very low self-esteem. I want to be found desirable, and I believe no one will. And he explains in the process that he's not ugly, he's not overweight, he exercises, he's more or less toned. So I say, who do you want to be desirable to? A good woman, yes, will be attracted to a good body, but that will not be the only or primary consideration. She'll be attracted to your mind, your personality, your fundamentals, your sense of life, as Ayn Rand calls it. And if she feels an affinity with this, then within a reason, your physical deficiencies will not be important to her. Now, you say that you have a normal body, but it doesn't lead to self-esteem. Well, of course, a body cannot lead to self-esteem. Self-esteem is evaluation of yourself as competent to perceive, judge, and evaluate the facts of reality and then act accordingly. It's an issue of judging your mind, of trusting your mind, of saying, I esteem my faculty of thought and valuing, and therefore corresponding action, because that is the self. As part of that, you want to have a good body, but a body alone is, without a mind, is meat. And that will get you, certain kinds of women, but that's all. You can be a cripple with a good mind and have self-esteem and be desirable. But you can also have the body of a Greek god and be a dolt, and then you won't have much of a woman desiring you unless that's the kind of woman you want. You have to, if you want people to be excited when they see your body, you have to first want them to be excited when they contact your mind, your spirit. Is the increasing vulgarity of our culture a result of increasing sentiments for liberty or an increase of desperation? I would say neither. It's not liberty. There's no connection between liberty and spewing obscenities. And in the most of the freest periods, such as the Enlightenment, the opposite was true. They would fall down dead if they saw what went on today, and that was a much freer period. You say it might be desperation? No. That is too serious and deep an emotion to explain vulgarity. I think desperation was because of crucial values at stake and is being threatened. I think rather all of this, today's vulgarity is a reflection of the collapse of values and standards as such, which you see everywhere. Parents uphold no standards, teachers teach nothing, movies are completely amoral. Everyone is taught whatever you feel is just as good as what everybody else feels, or they're taught by the egalitarians if somebody else does it. If you don't like it, put them down. We're continually, as you see in my book when it comes out, moving from the conceptual level to the perceptual level. And that means we're moving to the animal state. And the animal state does not have value standards. It reacts to sensations. And that's what is increasingly happening, reacting to whims. And you can see that. I think the best example is the volume of rock concerts. I'm not talking about the music, etc. Maybe that's because I'm old that I don't like that. But the volume, I went to one or two, just to see. And I was frightened at the level of the sound, even with the heavy earplugs that I had. That has to be perceptual level. It drowns out any conceptual faculty. I think it's a threat to survival. At least I stayed about an hour. That to me is like an example of a perceptual level culture, where what counts is blasting the percept. Now here is a question outside of reality. Would it be moral to steal the 2012 presidential election in order to give us individual rights? That is unreal. If we have reached a stage in which a candidate in favor of freedom is discredited and only the champions of statism can win, in other words, where your maneuver is necessary, then your country is lost, no matter even if you elect your president. A president is not omnipotent, and he cannot preside with totally counter ideas to those of the country. He simply wouldn't survive. Imagine, for instance, you steal the election for an advocate of freedom in a country such as we are today, and he comes in and says, okay, we're abolishing Medicare, farm subsidies, the welfare state, all regulations on Wall Street. How long would that president survive? You're in this position. You need a country philosophically prepared for a good president, or he can't be effective. If it's prepared, you don't have to steal. If it's not prepared, stealing will have no effect at all. Today is my Thanksgiving podcast. It's being aired a few days late, but I think the Thanksgiving atmosphere is still around, and it may be a little longer than usual, although I have one question only. The question is, given the desperate state of the United States today and the future we seem to be heading toward, do we still have anything to be thankful for? And my answer is yes, we do, but it's not obvious what it is. So let me explain. Well, in the context of giving thanks today, the first thing that comes to mind is the Founding Fathers. As you know, I think you might know from Objectivist writings, the philosopher behind the Founding Fathers was Aristotle. His philosophy went into eclipse and came back again and was finally applied by philosophers and picked up by the Founding Fathers during the period that is called the Enlightenment. The result was the first country founded on ideas. Our Founding Fathers were not tribal chiefs or power-lusting conquerors or a revelation-encrusted priesthood. They were thinkers of the Enlightenment. They were jeered at by traditionalists on both sides of the Atlantic, but they proposed to create a nation whose institutions would be without precedent and to do it on the basis of a theory, an abstract theory of the nature of man and the universe. The United States, they decided, would be the first nation to have an avowed philosophic meaning. Of course, the philosophy that they accepted was the philosophy of the Enlightenment. In essence, secularism, reality and the proper object of man's concern is this world and this life. Reason, the only oracle of man, in Ethan Allen's phrase, and man's proper goal, the pursuit of happiness, of his own happiness. These were the essentials of Aristotle's philosophy, and these were the essentials of the Enlightenment. The political expression the Founding Fathers saw was a country of limited government, a country of liberty, a country where men had the right to pursue their wealth, pursue profit, pursue their own achievements, and enjoy the results, and a government whose only function was to protect them in that pursuit. Now, this, as the basis of a country, led to a distinctive kind of people, a distinctive character, a distinctive American character that has often been noted as different from anything else we see around us or in the past. Ayn Rand called it the American sense of life. And by sense of life, she means, in effect, an unconscious philosophy, a philosophy that hasn't reached the form of explicit, well-known ideas to the people, but that in some terms they have that feeling, and that feeling in some way motivates them. That's where the country started. What happened then? The Enlightenment faded and disappeared. It's forgotten. Things have gotten intellectually ever worse. the ideas of the Enlightenment are no longer on the intellectual scene at all. So we can thank our founding fathers as a historic force, but the question is raised today, what is left of their achievements, since you don't see them in the universities, the museums in Washington, etc. Obviously, we are in a desperate state, and the founding fathers would be hard-pressed even to recognize it anymore. So I think the question we have to ask is, what is left in the souls or the subconscious of Americans, even if they don't know it explicitly? Is the Enlightenment spirit still alive today, even if underground? Now, that's a question I consider in my current book, The Dim Hypothesis, and I'll sketch in the kinds of evidence that you can see. You could write a whole book on this, but here's some, and more or less condensing now from my chapter on this topic. On the positive side, the main evidence is the long-term split, a unique split, between the intellectuals and the common-sense-oriented U.S. public. And that is a split without counterpart in Europe, a split between the intellectuals and the public. And you can see it here by the public's firm rejection of so many European trends that were uncontroversial over there. You can see the split by the time lag necessary for these European corruptions to be adopted by American institutions and government. I'm talking of anti-rational trends such as non-objective art, non-cognitive education, sex-interpreted man, obviously Freud, class war-interpreted society, obviously Marx, and all the rest. Now, our intellectuals gulped it all in. And so, from that point of view, they regarded America always as backwards and had a contempt for their own country without parallel elsewhere. The public is Philistines, according to them, and it's, quote, materialists. And that's true in the sense that Americans are more respectful than men elsewhere of wealth as a moral achievement. I think Americans are less envious, more eager to become rich by their own action, more confident of their ability to succeed in life. You can just look at the much greater proportion of small business in the United States than anywhere else. Doesn't that suggest a special American premium on initiative, self-reliance, the entrepreneurial spirit? And if we go to more narrow politics, you can see, I think, that Americans, as a rule, are notably less eager than others to subordinate their individuality to ever bigger government. Here again, on almost every issue, from the original birth here of the welfare state under FDR to its latest expression, Obama's socialized medicine, America has lagged well behind Europe. The intellectuals complain that they have had to drag this country into the future against the unwillingness of a reluctant public. Now, they have succeeded one after the other in dragging us, but they had to drag. Sartre, the French existentialist, famously complained that Americans did not believe in evil. In other words, in human impotence and depravity as the forces moving men. And that's a charge which speaks directly to the role of the Enlightenment in shaping the American subconscious. Because whenever Sartre would present what he regarded as insoluble dilemma of life, the Americans would always come back and say, we can fix problems by the use of reason and logic and thought. And his attitude was, Americans are hopeless. That is a naivety that I can't deal with. Okay, now let's look at the other side of the question. There is still a split between the intellectuals here and the public, but its root no longer seems to be primarily, certainly not totally, the public's common sense as against the intellectuals' irrationality. It seems more and more to be the public's growing embrace of religion, which the intellectuals don't accept. Now, for the evidence of that, I refer you to chapter 15 of my book. I think there is less respect now for the pursuers of profit and the owners of wealth today. There's greater willingness to believe all the detractors of among detractors of businessmen, entrepreneurs, profit seekers. There's a greater willingness to sacrifice or to let be taken away without protest material goods demanded by fashionable groups, ecological, ethnic, economic, whatever. There is less confidence, I think, in the individual's ability to achieve values on his own, by his own action. And, of course, given the fact that the government has become so massive, people have begun to sense the decline of Americanism, the decline of the country at home, and our ability to cope with enemies abroad. And as a result of that, I think there's a sense of futility, certainly of anxiety, of despair. Much of the public now does believe in evil, at least up to a point, in the sense that they believe there are crucial problems that are insoluble, hopeless to deal with. There's nothing we can do. Now, in regard to politics, much of the public still avows its opposition to big government, even though most of the country's active subgroups regularly demand more and more handouts and policies that they think are beneficial to themselves. So we have this spectacle. On the one hand, Americans are proud of their nation's long history of upholding men's rights, and they venerate the Constitution that protects them, and in some sense they sincerely do that. But on the other hand, they've had a long Christian and more recently egalitarian brainwashing, and so they have less and less of a problem with the country's history of increasingly violating the very rights that they worship the Constitution for including. Now, the optimistic interpretation is they don't know what they're doing and they could be straightened out. The pessimistic interpretation of this kind of contradiction is that the Enlightenment ideas are now largely rhetoric and that people actually have no coherent ideas or feelings on the subject. In any event, we can't deny the evidence of the public's change of character across time. People today accept, whether happily or passively or even unknowingly, they accept countless developments that their ancestors just a few generations back would have found horrendous or even inconceivable. Think of our grandfathers, I'm thinking in the 50s or the 60s, accustomed as they were to high school graduates with a reasonable literacy and knowledge. Could they even have imagined the teenagers who are turned out today, the deconceptualized teenagers, who rank in a recent test 27th in educational standing in the industrial world, right behind Bulgaria? Or take another example. Having participated in the nationwide uproar in the 40s when Truman attempted to take over the steel mills, do you think our grandparents could have imagined a time when a good part of the public cheered Washington's takeover of the banks, the auto industry, Wall Street, and who knows what next? Oh, one more, even more horrendous example. If you lived through the nationwide urgency to go to war and defend this country after Pearl Harbor, and to go to war, it had to be unconditional surrender. There's no idea of negotiation. Do you think they could have imagined the American public's acquiescence in two successive presidents who had either no response to 9/11 beyond a few empty words, or outright shameless appeasement of its perpetrators. They wouldn't have tolerated it. Whatever else is true, Americans today would be unrecognizable to the founding fathers that they extol. So how do I sum it up? The evidence in regard to the American sense of life is incoherent, being on its face almost systematically contradictory. What does that mean then about the sense of life? Is it still there as a viable factor in history? Or has it faded to the point of historical irrelevance? Now, I've sketched in some of the indications as to why there is some evidence in favor of both of these interpretations, but not conclusive evidence of both. My conclusion, to put it briefly, rests on the idea of the distinction between possible, probable, and certain. Probable is when you have some, but not a lot, evidence, as against arbitrary when you have none. Probable is when you have a preponderance of evidence. Certainty is when you have all as conclusive. And I'd say, given the situation we have today on this question, including the perverse ambiguities, only one conclusion seems to me permissible, and that is, it is possible that the Enlightenment viewpoint, possible, not arbitrary to say this, it is possible that the Enlightenment viewpoint is widespread and waiting within the American subconscious. It is possible that it has not atrophied to a state of historical irrelevance. But at this point, as Ayn Rand said 40 years ago, it is impossible to tell, and it is even more now because the better parts have atrophied more. So what does that leave us? It leaves us a possibility, maybe. What we can thank the Founding Fathers for, even given the whole state of the world since, is that they put so powerful and rational a base in this country that we still have a maybe. Now you say, well, isn't that a very pessimistic conclusion? Well, that's the issue of the glass being half full and the half empty. Because the negative side, maybe not, implies the maybe is. And let me say we have, I think, an extra strong maybe here, because the Aristotelian ideas which made the Founding Fathers possible are now reformulated by Ayn Rand, stripped of all the contradictions of the ages in the form of objectivism, and therefore are present in their most powerful form, so that if there is a remnants of a sense of life to be worked with, we now, if the potential is there, we now have the activating element, and if we could put the two together, we could redirect the country. So we have two powerful potentials today. A philosophy which may be able to turn things around, and a people who may be ready to accept it. And you cannot underestimate the reality of these two factors. If you looked at Germany or Russia or even England on each of these points, of course they had no objectivism, but they would never be receptive to objectivism. It's too counter to everything they believe. So there was no ideas and no public that would have been receptive even if they were there, which is why they all go the way they go. And so I think we have something to be thankful for. We can be thankful for the fact that we have a possible future, a possible way out, because we were given such a fantastic start. And on this basis, I want to say still, thank you, Thomas Jefferson. In the light of today's hot debate as to whether taxes should be raised only for the middle class and not for the evil people who make over $250,000, I can't resist quoting you from one of the main founders of the American Revolution and later a president, John Adams. I just want you to hear this without comment from me in contrast to anything that you hear or read today. I'm quoting him now. It is agreed that the end of all government is the good and ease of the people in a secure enjoyment of their rights without oppression. But it must be remembered that the rich are people as well as the poor, that they have rights as well as others, that they have as clear and as sacred a right to their large property as others have to theirs which is smaller, that oppression to them is as possible and as wicked as to others, unquote. Thank you, John Adams. Now, you discussed in a recent podcast that one of the most enjoyable decades of your life was the 50s, the Opar years, when you still had the drive of youth combined with the maturity of age. But you've also said that the dim book is your best. How can the best not be the most enjoyable? Well, the short answer is that the best is the hardest, certainly in my case, because it is the broadest integration. I have a theory here that some people, some intellectuals at least, go through 3 stages in creativity. And I got this first by watching Ayn Rand, her development. Her first book was We the Living, in which was the simplest. She was concerned to get out of her system, answer and finish with communism in Soviet Russia. Her next book was the positive statement of her philosophy. All errors of the past were out of the way now, and she was concerned with the simple, complex, but simple, direct statement of her fundamental ideas. And then her last book, Atlas, was the final integration of everything she knew, the positive statement and the negative and all the forms of each in all the areas. Now, she was an excellent writer, so she did not find, and thinker, she did not find that it got harder and harder as she grew on. Now, I believe, and I in no way mean to presume any comparison to Ayn Rand, not even the faintest, but if you'll allow me this, I feel that I've gone through 3 equivalent stages. My first book, The Ominous Parallels, was getting out of my mind graduate school, which was to me the equivalent of Soviet Russia in the sense of what I mentally had to cope with. My positive statement, the equivalent of the Fountainhead, was Opar, a straight statement of the truth. And then my dim is magnum opus, my finale, where I integrate everything I know, negative and positive, into one overview, summing up everything I've gotten out of life. For me, this one has so great an integration that it's almost too all-encompassing for me to keep in mind. I deal with 5 different forms of thinking, forms of epistemology, as applied to 4 different cultural subjects as they appear in 6 different Western civilizations. So to keep all that in mind is mind-breaking, and that's why it's both the best but the least enjoyable. It's grief and agony, more or less from beginning to end, combined with the fact that, as against Ayn Rand, I have always found philosophy, and especially writing philosophy, hard, and I've wondered a number of times, maybe the whole subject is just too hard for me because it's always been a bloody struggle to understand and then to write it out, where she did not have that. Nevertheless, I persisted, and that explains why it's the best but the least enjoyable. Okay, what is wrong with the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, when applied to persons who have not yet hurt you in any way. Well, what's wrong with that is it makes ethics subjective. It says, you figure out what you want people to do to you, and then you do it to them. You want them to let you cheat, so you let them cheat. What is it that you want from other people? You want them to loot from you, you want to loot from them. It's not an objective moral principle. It's an attempt to make a universal moral principle that's applicable to everyone. And that's what essentially Kant put forward as like the universalizability criterion. Can everyone obey it? But that is not the same as objectivity. Objectivity is not, can everyone obey it, but should everyone obey it? And that has to be decided by reality, not by mutual satisfaction of desire. A question from a man tortured by unrequited love. I just don't understand why it should be important to me that this woman reciprocates my love, but it obviously is. Her loving me would change none of the fundamental values that I love her for having. So why should her feelings matter to me? I would say because love is not the same as walking in a museum to contemplate your values. Love is a part of your actual life. And once you have contemplated her and her values, she's not a statue. She's something you want for yourself, and obviously in this context, sexually. So you seem to think that if you're aware of her values, that's all you want from her. You don't care whether she has any response, but you want her response so that you can consummate in your own life the meaning of those values to you. It's like the difference between consciousness and existence, between loving somebody and holding somebody, between valuing them and sleeping with them. Now, Aldous Huxley has made clear why, in the right context, sex is a proper and necessary expression of love. So if you love her in the objective sense and not in the platonic sense, that means a real partner. Your love implies, I've found her. She's my soulmate. And naturally then, it's important to you what her reaction is. So there's no mystery to that. But the point is, it should not go on forever. If she says no, and she obviously means it, then she is not your soulmate, and by her own definition. And then you can only contemplate her as in a museum. You can admire her, but since that possibility is cut off from your life, and it brings up only unhappy memories, I would say go out and find a living statue to contemplate and then go to bed with, and forget about her. Okay, from a vegan. A vegan is not allowed to eat anything, if I remember correctly, except fruits and vegetables, not dairy, and nothing from animals. I think that's the right definition. Why not move towards a vegan world whenever possible? He's talking about in your own private actions. He doesn't mean the government. You can still live as a vegan healthily, and I wonder whether the taste of meat is really more valuable than the animal's freedom and life. Well, first of all, I challenge scientifically that you can be healthy long-term on a vegan diet. I believe that has been factually disproven in regard to proteins. Now, I have to say, I confess that I did do that once for 2 weeks as an attempted diet, but it didn't work because I was too hungry. But I don't believe that that is a healthy long-term diet. But even suppose it were, that is not the issue. The whole moral issue is in this. And I quote you again. Isn't this taste really, or is it really more valuable than the animal? More valuable to whom? Value is not a fact just inhering out there that we grasp by intuition. Value is an assessment of something in relation to a valuer. Now you're saying about man that man should not place his life and its enjoyment above that of the cow, say. And that is egalitarianism, which is, in other words, you're obliterating the difference to man between man and the other species. For us, the standard, the selfish, rational standard is our pleasure outweighs that of other species. We do not agree that every country is equally good, and every writer in history is equally good, and every child at school is equally smart, and every species is equally important. You can read my book if you have any questions about that. This doesn't mean we can get irrational pleasure, for instance, by torturing species. That's a different question. But we're talking about getting pleasure for something that's connected to our lives and our functioning. If something gives you more pleasure, that outweighs the rights, not the rights, but the what other species want. Now, let me take the other point of view. If I was a cow, from that viewpoint, I would say this is wrong, because a cow's life comes first, and that would be valid. Except, cows can't do it; they can't raise the question, and that is their problem. But as it stands right now, we can define and assert rights. We say that there's no way to communicate with cows. So that's it. Our pleasure outweighs their life. Now here's one. If an objectivist wins $100 million in the lottery, what should he do with the money? No, the obvious answer is, leaving aside whatever context and obligations he's already assumed, he should do whatever makes him selfishly happy. He should do whatever makes him selfishly happy. How could a philosophy tell you, if you get $50 or $100, $1,000, $200, it's up to you to decide. But $100 million, here we come in with the rule. What would the rule be? Should we say, well, you should give $99 million to spread ideas? Well, no. That depends on their importance to you. What is your hierarchy of dreams in life? What is most important to you? What if you find that you can get a seat on one of these spaceships for $50 million? They're going to have commercial rockets, and you'd rather do that than see a professor of philosophy at Harvard. That is entirely up to you. Now, you're going to help friends if you want to, but I say only within limits, and only if you tell yourself this is not, quote, being moral, unquote. It is just as moral to spend it on decorating your backyard as giving it to the needy. As far as charity, in my experience, almost all organized charities are a scam. 80 to 90% goes to that they receive goes to the costs of the bureaucracy and the staff, etc. So you're wasting your $100 million if you do it there. But the answer in a nutshell is figure out you're only here on this earth for a certain number of seconds. You can calculate, but it is a number of seconds. What do you want out of this life? No obligations. I understand that Ayn Rand wrote her fiction in longhand. Would she have used a word processor to write any subsequent novels if she were alive when the technology existed? I'm sure the answer to that is no, and by the way, it would be a no for me also. Because your form of creativity, of expressing creativity, the form of actually physically doing it, I believe is automatized when you're very young. So writing for her and for me becomes the link between the thought and the product. It's like the fingers. It becomes literally a part of you. And you do not believe, you don't sense that any machine could do it. Now, for instance, I always wrote in ink as she did, then typed up the copy, But I couldn't do creative work as I was typing it, and then read the typing and made the editorial corrections. I personally find, and I'm sure she did, that a lot of editing is lightning changes of mind. You change one word to another, and then you reread it, and you want the other one back. And then you want to look at both of them together. Well, when they're all there in the same page, it's very easy to do. Now, I hasten to say, I know that if you know copy and paste and all the rest of it, you can get the same effect. But for someone who is brought up on writing, it's infinitely easier to keep the thought in mind because they can never automatize cut and paste the way we automatize looking from one letter to the other. But having said all that, I would say that if we had been brought up with computers and that had become, our way of identifying, our way of communicating, our way of putting our thoughts out into the world, then I think it certainly could be a different response. But to me, the pen is unique. I cannot do creative work on typing, except, I quickly add, I can if it's to be delivered orally. I find that I can do typing, but I don't find there's any difficulty in presenting oral material. I can just zip it out. But when you're doing something, what I call serious, you're trying to write something, then I can't do it except by pen.